there's no fireworks in South County, Dutchess County, Morrison County, by the DNR.
Oh, shit.
Including the city of St.
No.
Yeah.
So it reads as outside the city limits. All the email-
Recording in progress.
They're trying to shut it.
I mean, you could set all safe.
Yeah, everything's are the same. When you did you check it? Hey, Mike, did you send us the updated? Did you send us the updated? Did you? Okay, you're just sending. Oh, my head from my.
I'd be happy.
Okay, because I'd like to send it to the DNR too.
Department of 22 years ago to Wapaton.
Okay, it's 7 o'clock.
Just inside Wapaton.
I would like to welcome everybody tonight, and we will be having the Todd County Board of Commissioners hearing, acting as drainage authority for Todd County Ditch 41. This is, all commissioners are present along with our coordinator and Jolene from the Auditor Treasurer's Office. We will now stand for the pledge. I pledge to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Kurt, if you would like to take over.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kurt Dieter. I'm an attorney with Rinke Noonan and St. Cloud. I represent the Drainage Authority on drainage matters, which happens to be in this case, the Todd County Board of Commissioners. Tonight, I'll also be acting as the moderator as we go through this hearing. I first want to talk a little bit about the purpose. Most of you know, but Minnesota has a drainage code 103E. And that drainage code has what are called county ditches. And in this particular case, it's Todd County Ditch 41. The county commissioners act as the banker and referee basically of the ditch system. They manage the ditch system. They do not, even though it's called a county ditch, county ditches are not owned by the county. They're owned by the people that are within the benefited area of that particular ditch who are assessed to build that ditch. One of the sections of the statute 103E.401 allows property that's not within the benefited area to petition to be able to outlet into the system. And that's the purpose of tonight's meeting. The Drainage Authority has received a petition to outlet into Todd County Ditch 41 under section 401. That requires a public hearing with information that will be provided tonight. My job as moderator will be simply to make sure that things are on the record. The board makes their decision based on evidence that is, quote, on the record. So tonight I'll be beginning by going through and making sure we list all the documents that the Todd County Board has received to this point. And when we get to the people that are testifying, including petitioners and landowners, I will try and be unobtrusive, but I will be a stickler to the fact that because it's important what everybody says, but we need to have it on the record. We're recording this. There are people also virtually watching this so that if somebody shouts out something in the back, it won't become part of the record. So again, I'm not trying to be a stickler on things, but I think it's important what everybody says. So you'll be asked to come up and identify yourself so that we have a record of who said what when. So, and again, you have an agenda in front of you. The only two additions will be, as I said, I'm going to go through the documents so that we have a clear record of what's been submitted to this point. If you have something that you want submitted, you need to make sure that when you're up here that you indicate you'd like that part of the record so that we can put that document with the other documents. The other thing is after, you'll see under number 4, after Nancy Eulenkamp, who's the drainage administrator, goes through the notice requirements, she's also going to go over a little bit of an overview of the ditch 41. Just a little bit of the history where it's located. Many people know that, but we don't know who's not been at the informational meetings or who may be virtually watching. So we want to orientate where we are in this process. So with that, and I'll open it up on procedural questions in a moment, but I just want to make a record of what we have at this point that will be in the record for the board to consider. We have the outlet petition and accompanying documents that are part of the record. And I'm not going to obviously read all these, just to make a list of them. We have the Morrison County Resolution 2021-044. We have letters of support and a letter received that objects to the process or to the outlet. All those letters, again, we're trying to be as transparent as possible. So there's nothing secretive about this book. All this information is public record. So anybody is free to go to Todd County or tonight. None of this is something that everybody can't look at. It's all public record. Then there's a CDI informational presentation. Those of you that were at the informational meeting, there's a PowerPoint presentation that was submitted at that time. There's some informational meeting, again, a PowerPoint presentation. Again, everybody's free to look at it. There's a handout from the petitioner, the lid that's titled Lake Shamana Lake Improvement District High Water Outlet Project. There's the agenda from tonight's meeting, June 29th, 7 p.m. that we've talked about. And then there's a report from Houston Engineering concerning this project, along with an accompanying maps and other documents. There's a lid public hearing handout that may be discussed tonight or presented again tonight, but it's already been made part of the record. There's a DNR overview email from, I think it's Tim Crocker, dated June 24th, 2021. There's an operation and maintenance plan submitted by petitioner that's part of the record. And again, I'm sure will be referred to by the petitioners and made even more clear that it's part of the record. And then in addition, there's some additional letters of support that will make part of the record. There's a MnDOT preliminary review and ability to obtain a permit is quotation marks good to go and quotation mark email. There's an Army Corps of Engineer explanation of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. There's an Environmental Protection Agency and EPA regulatory requirements for Section 404 of the Clean Water Act for dredging or filling. Number 5, there's the County Ditch 41 info meeting agenda history and assessments that Nancy may talk more about. And that there's an example of an outlet fee from Todd County Ditch 15 for the city of Bertha that was back, I believe, in 2012 that somebody has submitted or indicated wanted part of the record. Again, all of this may have different evidentiary weight, but it's all part of the record, whether some is relevant or not relevant. That'll be for this board to decide in making their decision. So procedurally, before we start going through the agenda, are there any questions, not on the project or anything, but just process? All right, with that, I think we'll have Nancy go through the record that the notice requirements were sent out and that a little bit of history on this ditch or documents.
Okay, so the notice requirements for ditch 41, the public notice was run in the newspapers, the 5 newspapers of the county, the week of June 6th, 13th, and the 20th, 2021. Landowner letters, June 7th, 2021. All landowners on the assessment roll were sent an invite letter to this meeting. And landowners that are along the route of the new ditch were also mailed that letter on June 7th. There were 102 letters total that were sent. Public notice was put on website announcements. It was put on the board agenda page, and it was posted outside the auditor treasurer's office. And so I'm just going to go through just a little bit. I know a lot of you were here, but a lot of you were not. The presentation I did at the last meeting, just the history of this ditch and the location. The ditch was built in 1916. It's located in Fawn Lake Township. It was designed to be 23.74 miles long, but the approved ditch is only 12.8 miles long. 6.53 miles of that is the main ditch and 6.36 miles of that are the laterals. Original ditch cost $23,792. There's no records of anything being done on this ditch system since 1916. There was a petition in 1984 that was submitted to clean the ditch. The only documentation I have that was along with that petition was some per diems for the board. There was never an assessment done, and there was never any records showing that it was an approved petition. So I assume the petition was not approved and it was dropped at that time. Beaver trapping, dam removal, and ditch inspector fees have been really the only expenses on this ditch system. And then I just kind of outlined, we've got a pretty good beaver problem on this ditch system. It's extremely good habitat for beaver. So in 2013, when we did records modernization, we cleaned up all the assessment rolls. We assessed for ditch, for beaver issues from 2008 to 2012 of the $5,484.23. And then we got the ditch system brought up to zero. And then we started doing assessments, not yearly after that, but close to yearly. 2015 was $1,917.32. And that was all beaver dam or beaver expenses. 2018, $5,000 beaver expenses. 2019, $4,000 beaver expenses. The reason those are even numbers is because we wanted to have a cushion in the ditch. So as we kept doing beaver expenses, we would have money to cover it each year. And then in 2020, we started dropping in how much beaver expenses we were having. We were finally getting a little caught up. So in 2020, we did $500. 2021, we did $500. For 2022, we've been doing trapping again and some dam removal. So there's going to be those expenses again for the next year. I think that's all I have. So that Mike can take over.
All right, so again, I'll try and moderate this. As you see, we're on number 5 on the agenda, and that's the presentation by petitioners. It could be a number of different people, but again, this is there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask questions, so a question may come up during your presentation. But again, to try and make this so the record makes sense, please save your questions till their presentation is done. Thank you.
Oh, okay, got it. Just nod. There we go. Good evening. Madam Chair, members of the board, my name is Cindy Kevern. I'm the administrator of the Lake Shamana Lake Improvement District. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Todd County Board of Commissioners for having this public hearing and providing us the opportunity to present information on our high water outlet project. Couple notes that I'd like to start off with. We're going to use the acronym LID throughout, which is Lake Improvement District. We're also going to talk about LSLID, which is Lake Shamana Lake Improvement District. Also, there's a bunch of handouts on, there should be 5 handouts, I believe, on the table. So if you don't have a handout, you might want to get one. And also there at the end of our presentation, and there's a number of spots, we have contact information. So if after this meeting, anybody has a question for us, please feel free to contact us. I have a few slides that I'm going to be walking through before we get to the technical information. I'd like to note that all the pictures in the slides are from the lake, even this one. So we're starting with a fun picture. And we'd like to start with introductions from the board. The board members are going to take the opportunity when they do their introduction to give a few quick comments on some of the key points of the project. I'm going to start with Rick Rosar. And before he gets to speak, I'm going to mention that this is a house on the lake. It represents one of several homes that have had to fill in their basement with cement. So this is one example with sandbags, and they actually have, you can see water being pumped out of the basement as well. So Rick.
So I wanted to start off, first of all, and I believe Commissioner Lemire from Morrison County's on Zoom here, because there was some conversation about Morrison County at the info meeting. And I just wanted to mention that Morrison County has been very supportive of the Lake Shaman Lake Improvement District and their determination to find a solution to the high water problem on Lake Shamana. The Morrison County Board and county agencies have helped us to work on many project details, which has helped us to expedite the project. The county has assisted us with wetland delineation, educating the lid on the Board of Adjustment procedures, and supplying valuable information to expedite the approval processes. Morrison County has delegated the authority to the lid to find a feasible solution and understands that the engineering study shows that there is ample capacity in ditch 41 for this pumping project. To show support for the project, Morrison County Board voted unanimously to contribute $200,000 towards the maintenance of ditch 41. We understand from Todd County that these funds could be used by the ditch authority to clean the ditch and assist with beaver control. The intent of the funds from Morrison County is to use it solely for the maintenance of ditch 41. Besides the normal beaver trapping and dam removal, this money could also be used for additional maintenance like erosion control, cleaning certain areas of the creek, and especially cleaning the laterals, which have been growing over for more than 100 years. We also understand that there's only been limited funds available for maintenance over the last several years, so these funds can provide maintenance for many years to come. We believe this is truly a win-win situation for both the Lake Chamonix property owners in Scandia Valley, as well as the ditch 41 benefited property owners in Fond Lake Township.
Next, we have Bob Cole. And this happens to be a picture of his front yard, and it shows how he has water coming up and has had to sandbag, and he actually has some pumping going on as well.
That picture,
Bob, would you identify yourself?
Oh,
Just your
sure.
address, you know?
okay. Yeah, I'm Bob Cole, I'm Vice Chair of the Lake Shaman Lake Improvement District. I really appreciate you having this hearing for us today. That was taken 2 years ago. And since then, the water is up. Actually, those sandbags are 7 layers higher, and they're doubled, and they're covered with plastic now. There was had a sump pump on the shore side of the bags, then 40 feet more towards the house, which is beyond the first part of the dock. I had another sump pump, and then inside the house, on the basement floor, below that, there was another big sump pump. There is still. Okay. What I'm going to just review is number 23 on the questions document. You might have the questions, a question document, and I don't know if you have the picture available of that. Probably not. Okay. So anyway, what that is, question 23 is, can you provide an example of how much the 10 CFS, 10 cubic feet per second from the project will impact water levels in the ditch? And under the average conditions, an additional 10 CFS from the Lake Shaman Lake Improvement District pumping project will cause the water levels to rise approximately 2.5 inches. Portions of the ditch with more grade and wider channel bottoms will see less of an impact. And then what's nice about the handout, if you have the handout, you can see these culverts that Mike has created for us. There's the culvert on Pulaski Road at the intersection of Pulaski Road and Todd County Ditch 41. There's 3.7 inches, 3 feet 7 inches of water in the culvert bottom, and then adding the 10 CFS adds 1.25 inches of water. So you can see the blue water in the ditch And you can see the red line, which is the 1.4 inches of water, which to me looks pretty minimal. And then the other culvert on Quicken Road is also got the culvert displayed in blue. There's 2 feet 0.5 inches in the ditch, and then there's 1.6 inches of water from the lake project, that 10 CFS. Now, you're going to hear more details about that, Mike Opat, when he does his presentation. He'll have several references to situations like this and get in more detail with explaining it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Next, we have Fred
If I could
Cole.
just interrupt just for a sec. It may have been part of what I marked before as part of the record, but there were some handouts on the table over here. And
Yes.
they may be part of it already, but I'm just going to indicate because I picked them up. There's a Lake Shamana Lake improvement, and that's the questions Bob was talking about. There's a number of questions. There's a map provided by Houston Engineering that says Todd County Ditch 41 flow direction and elevation map. And there is an aerial map that says Lake Shamana Improvement District proposed outlet route. So again, they may have been part of these other documents, but I just want to make sure that they're part of the records.
Thank you. Next will be Fred Combe. And this is actually Fred Combs' cabin. On the left, you can see it's obviously an older picture, and you can see a house on the right by the car. The cabin on the right is actually the same home. So that kind of shows a big difference in lake level, obviously. And Fred is our treasurer of the board. Thank you, Fred.
Yes, Madam Chair, Commissioners, Todd County staff, thank you all for being here on this wonderful, beautiful Tuesday, warm, beautiful evening. Let's see. I'd like to take just a moment to discuss a couple of quick things here. First, I know that a lot of people have been reading newspaper articles. Some may have, thank you. Some may have seen TV coverage. I know helicopters were flying over broadcast stations from the Twin Cities, have done a number of shows on Lake Shamano. But I wanted to take a brief moment to thank all of those people that you don't see. There are hundreds of people working behind the scenes. Some may be in office behind a desk in Fargo, Detroit Lakes, Brainerd, St. Paul, the state capitol. There's a whole bunch of people that you don't see here. And thank you all for those who are here. But there's so many more. Just wanted to reach out and recognize and say thanks to those people that you don't see. Secondly, I'm not a commissioner, but if I was a commissioner tonight, there'd be one question that I think would be the most important question, and that is, does Ditch 41 have the capacity to handle the water that Lake Shamano is intending to put into that ditch? And I think in your handout, the newer questions for today start with question number 14, and it asks and answers that very question. Is there existing capacity in Ditch 41 for the water that would flow from Lake Shamano water outlet? The answer is yes. The LID has contracted with Houston Engineering to manage, oversee engineering, design, permitting, and construction of the project. Houston Engineering has concluded there is ample capacity in Ditch 41 to accommodate the minimal flows from this project. So I guess I want to say thank you for taking your valuable time. And I do hope that you will vote in positive to allow this petition to move through. So thank you.
Thank you, Fred. The next one is Tim Rice. This is not Tim Rice's home, but it is an example of some of the cabins and homes on the lake that have been totally destroyed by the flooding.
Again, I'm Tim Rice, and I'm one of the newer members on the LID board. Again, thank you for considering our petition request. I just want to expand a little bit more on what's already been presented, just to give you a little more information about the project. As far as myself, again, personally, again, that's not my home, but I definitely had to invest in a lot of protection of the property, pumping as well. And, even just personally, as far as my own experience, as far as because that is my permanent home, and I do live there year round. As far as other additional information that we feel that would be very helpful, the project will include a maximum pumping rate of 10 cubic feet per second, and there's been, like, how do you describe that? We're looking at, that's about 1 to 2 inches. The project will include pumping approximately 9 months of the year. But if the creek is naturally higher for any specific reason or amount of time, we would not be able to pump again until it goes down. Again, the project will lower the water level. The goal is on the Lake Shamana down to the ordinary high water level. Also, the project itself includes a mechanical filter to prevent Eurasian water milfoil, and again, following the Minnesota DNR guidelines and approval. I think also with this, with the pumping rate and the time period is presented, pumping will probably occur over 3 to 4 years, and future pumping after the initial period would only be needed depending on, and again, if the lake level rises. So again, we just appreciate you considering the petition. Thank you.
And then our fifth member is Artis Sandstrom, who is the secretary for the board. This is a picture of how the lake has created its own outlet on the west side. So the lake actually went over the shore, went over the banks, and is now creating its own little outlet on the west side.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is Artis Sandstrom, and I own a home at 4399 Cantleberry Road, which is on the east end of Lake Shamana. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to meet with us tonight and consider our petition. Tonight, I'm commenting on question number 17. About a year ago, the LID analyzed possible routes for pumping water out of Lake Shamana. Engineers provided guidance to the Lake Shamana Improvement District on options, and after preliminary engineering and environmental analysis of the alternatives, it was determined that the proposed option is the most feasible. I currently sit on the committee for the Long Prairie One Watershed One Plan. This program allows counties to transition from county-based water management planning to watershed-based planning. The planning area for the Long Prairie One Watershed One Plan includes portions of Douglas, Ottertail, Wadena, Todd, and Morrison counties. As you may know, Lake Shamana is within the watershed area of Ditch 41 and the Long Prairie River. Both Houston Engineering and Woodseth Engineering have analyzed the water issues on Lake Shamana, and both firms agree that as Lake Shamana has risen, and if the rising water is not addressed, the lake will naturally overflow in an uncontrolled fashion to the west and into Ditch 41 at the natural overflow elevation. If allowed to naturally overflow, the water would move downstream in an uncontrolled manner. Thus, with the construction of the proposed project, discharge from the lake can be controlled. The water quality issues can be managed, and adverse impacts can be avoided in the watershed and Ditch 41. Thank you.
And as I mentioned, my name is Cindy Kevern. I'm the administrator for the Lake Shamana LID. And you might look at this picture and say, oh, isn't that a pretty picture of trees in the fall or of a sunset? Actually, it's a picture of the island, and you can see on the whole edge of the island, all of the trees are dead. And they're beautiful, big pine trees. By the way, I live at 3484 Oak Lane on Lake Shamana. I'd like to take a quick opportunity to emphasize the operations plan as a key component of the outlet project. A draft of the operations plan has been provided to Todd County, and Mike Opat will go into it in greater detail later in the evening. I just want to note a couple of quick important points. For example, the plan includes a requirement that the maximum discharge will not be any more than 10 CFS. There's also a requirement that notification will be made to Todd County prior to the start of pumping and when the pumps are turned off. There is a requirement that discharge from the outlet will not cause water levels in any downstream water body exceed its ordinary high water level or any other stipulated levels. Mike will talk later about those stipulated levels in the ditch system because the plan includes monitoring guidelines for those elevation levels for assurance that we will not exceed them. Spring flooding and rain events will require additional monitoring that are specified in the plan. River forecasts will be closely monitored and gauges will be used to alert the lid when pumping must cease. When heavy rain causes the ditch to rise, the lid will have gauges to alert and pumping will cease. When water elevations are too high, the plan includes daily monitoring of those gauges and also watching carefully for weather forecasts. Most importantly, the plan will include input and conditions from Todd County and will be a requirement for the DNR permit for pumping. If the lid pumps in violation of the requirements of the plan, the lid risks the loss of the DNR permit and as a result, the ability to operate the project. And with that, I'd like to just go through some quick project background. Some of the points have already been talked about, so some of it I will actually try to go through a little bit quickly. Most of you are probably familiar with the lake. The lake is located east of Highway 10 in Morrison County. There are about 300 homes, cabins, commercial properties on the lake. They're of various sizes, age, some are seasonal, some are permanent, and they're also at various elevations of the lake. Many I want to mention have been owned for generations. One of the things you get when you talk about the flooding on the lake is you get people very emotional because it's where they came as children. Fred Combs is a good example, and they're hoping that their grandchildren can also come to the lake. The lake is a closed watershed basin with no outlet. There's been increasing water levels for many years. Water has risen over 7 feet since 1962. 1962 is the first recorded water level on the lake from the DNR. You saw Fred Combs' picture. It's probably risen even more than that because that picture is quite a bit older. The lake is now about 2.3 feet over the ordinary high water level. The rise in the water is caused by higher than normal precipitation, and the lake having no natural outlet. The Lake Improvement District has the support of property owners to develop a high water outlet project. Last August in 2020, over 74% voted in favor of a project to construct an outlet. Artis actually mentioned some of this. Last year, we analyzed routes for pumping water out of Lake Shamana. We looked at several different options. We consulted with engineers, both from Houston and Widseth, to provide guidance and preliminary engineering and environmental analysis. The west option through Ditch 41 was determined to be the most feasible. And as Artis mentioned, if the lake is left naturally to overflow in an uncontrolled fashion, the engineers have noted that water from the lake would flow downstream within the watershed area of Ditch 41 and the Long Prairie River. The construction of this project will move the water downstream in a more controlled manner with management of water quality, and also adverse impacts can be avoided. And I just want to circle back. We chose this route last year, and we've been working over this past year on gathering engineering information, completing surveys, completing designs, talking with property owners. So we've had a lot of work invested to this point and to get us ready actually to come forward to you for approval of the petition. The purpose of the high water outlet project is to establish a maximum operating level. It includes the installation of a lake outlet structure and pumping station at the west end of the lake. And I think you have a route map in your handouts that you can see that. Water will then flow west, eventually to Ditch 41 and to the Long Prairie River. We've worked very closely with landowners, property owners along the route, and the route being west of Highway 10 to the railroad crossing, which Ditch 41 starts. So those property owners are actually what we consider along our route. We work very heavily with them to obtain agreements for easements, and we have them from all of those property owners. We've also received letters of support from Todd County property owners. Some of those are along our route, some along Ditch 41, and other county residents. In fact, today we presented the Todd County Board with over 50 signatures on letters of support. And we'd like to take this opportunity to thank those that are with us today for their support. couple of other project details. Funding will be made through charges to Lake Shamana property owners and also with Minnesota DNR flood mitigation grant funds. No petition costs will be charged to Todd County residents. All expenses will be paid by the lid. We'd also like to thank Morrison County for their support. I know that Commissioner Lemire from Morrison County wanted to be here tonight, but had a conflict, and I believe he might be joining us through Zoom. But we do want to thank them for their support. They, as somebody mentioned, they actually delegated authority to us for the project, and they've worked very closely with us on some of the project details. And of course, they recently voted to contribute $200,000 toward the maintenance of Ditch 41 upon award of the construction contract for the project. An operating plan, as I mentioned, will be talked about more closely with Mike later in the presentation, but it's also a very key component of the project. Managing the lake level will assist the surrounding watershed by creating a storage area in the Morrison County wetlands, preventing excess rainwater to immediately flow downstream to Todd County. And last, but certainly not least, what if the petition is not approved? The petition is not approved. The high water outlet project will not be able to move forward since access to Ditch 41 to reach the Long Prairie River is a key component of this project. And obviously, if it doesn't move forward, the $200,000 would not also be made available from Morrison County. And more importantly to us, there'll be continued flooding of homes and roads and more property damage around Lake Shamana and Scandia Valley. And next, I'd like to introduce John Shockley, who is an attorney with the firm Onstead Twitchell. The lid has hired John to assist with the legal aspects of the project, and he'll be reviewing the petition process.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the County Commission. My name is John Shockley, and I serve as attorney for the lid. I have extensive experience working with water projects, both on the side of the petitioner and on the ditch authority side. The petition process for this outlet petition is governed by Minnesota statute 103E.401. I believe that your attorney, Mr. Dieter, had covered that previously, so I'm not going to go into a great detail about that process. But as you know, Todd County Commission is the drainage authority, and that express authority to outlet into Drain 41 is started through the filing of a petition. The lid filed that petition with Todd County on March 8th, 2021. That described the necessity of the project that you've heard tonight. And it also described the project features. Our petition, as was noted, included an engineering report on Ditch 41 and its capacity for the project. That, of course, caused the County Commission to set a public hearing. We did have a public informational hearing on June 1st, 2021. If there are members of the public that are interested in where that recording can be found, we've listed out the web address. Just briefly, the petition process involves the public hearing tonight. We're making our presentation regarding the project. And as I think has been previously noted, the main consideration regarding the granting of the petition is whether or not Ditch 41 has capacity. And I think this is more of a unique project than most. This is not just simply a property owner requesting an uncontrolled lateral to outlet into the existing ditch. Here you have a project in which it only pumps when the pumps are going. So you have controlled water flow into the system. So during high water events, you're not actually adding additional water into the system. And so I like to think that it's very easy to satisfy the condition, is there sufficient capacity within Ditch 41? Because at no point will this project operate when you have high water. So there will always be sufficient capacity within the channel. If you grant the petition, we would anticipate that you would set the terms and conditions for our outlet. You would set the outlet fee, and then you would also describe what property is benefited by the use of Ditch 41. Having worked on projects very similar to this, the operating plan is really a critical component. And we recognize that. That is how the ditch authority prescribes the controls of when and how we can pump water out of the lake into the ditch. And so that really protects the property owners from ensuring that we're not pumping during high water time periods. And also it sets forth, if we're violating that operating plan, we risk losing the ability to discharge into the ditch 41. So really at the end of the day, the ditch has the capacity, as our engineering team will show. And really you need to look at what's in the operating plan and make sure that you're comfortable with the operating plan. And then we'll have DNR approval for that along with the DNR permit. And the lid will be obligated to follow the conditions of the operating plan. Mike Opat from Houston Engineering is going to cover those technical considerations, which I think will show, and the evidence will establish that the ditch has sufficient capacity for this project. And he's also going to go through some of the technical aspects of the operating plan.
All right, good evening. Madam Chair, members of the Board of Commission, acting as the Drainage Authority this evening, and members of the audience. My name is Mike Opat. I'm with Houston Engineering. I'm a civil engineer. I'm serving as the project manager on the project for the Lake Chamano Lake Improvement District. I'm going to apologize here ahead of time. I'm going to be standing here for the bulk of my presentation. For those standing behind me, if there's another chair available, feel free to move. I do apologize, but you are getting probably the better side of me. So with that, just a quick introduction. Both myself and our company have a lot of experience working with lake outlet projects similar to the one that the Lake Improvement District is proposing here. Most recently, we completed a project near Perham on the Little McDonald curves in Paul Lake and Devil's Lake systems. You may hear some references to that this evening. That's a very similar project. And again, a key component of that project was the operating plan. And as we'll talk about, that operating plan kind of served as the template for the draft that we're going to talk about tonight. In addition to lake outlets, we've also assisted many drainage authorities such as yourselves on ditch projects and petitions throughout the state. So we've got a wealth of experience from that standpoint as well. And definitely understand what you're going through here with this process, and we're trying to help you. And Kurt walk you through it here. So with that, we also have a lot of expertise in hydrologic and hydraulic modeling of ditch and streams and those types of systems. We do a lot of work with the DNR and FEMA and those types of models. And as we'll talk about, there's some relevance to that here with this project as well. So before I get into it, I do want to preface that we do have a lot of slides. I think the board can see the packet there. I've talked to Kurt and with permission from Madam Chairman, if Kurt sees people looking like they need a break, just by all means jump in and we'll take a quick break and then reconvene. And that being said, while there are a lot of slides, I don't want that to be confused that this is an overly complicated project or that there's a lot of complicated factors here, because actually it's fairly straightforward, as John said. The simple question with the petition is whether or not there is capacity, and John spelled that out very clearly with the operating plan and the controls offered by the pump. We can clearly say that there's capacity. It's just a matter of defining when and how much. And so that's what's then covered by the operating plan and the triggers that are put in there. So with that, the slides, many of you that were at the public meeting are going to recognize a lot of this, and it's going to sound familiar. As a courtesy to those who weren't at the public informational meeting, we are going to go over it again. And again, part of the reason a lot of these slides are here is just to build the public record. So I won't necessarily get into all of it in great detail, just to keep things moving, but I definitely will hit on the important parts, and then we can certainly address any of the questions that come up. So a few quick definitions: cubic feet per second, annotated by CFS. That's a flow rate. That's how we in the engineering world, that's how the flood forecasters all deal with flows and streams. So that's why we use that. I know a lot of people like to hear things in gallons, so there's the conversion there. 1 cubic foot is 7.48 gallons. We'll have some more discussions on gallons here in a second. If we refer to AIS, that's aquatic invasive species. There's not as much talk tonight about 2-year flows and 100-year flows and those types of things. If we do come to that, I will explain that. As Cindy said, LSLID is the Lake Chamano Lake Improvement District. I want to note that all the elevations in my presentation refer to the vertical datum of 1929. I know the county has other data that's in the 1988 datum. The Lake Chamano records and readings are all in the 29 datum, so we're designing our project to 29 for consistency. We're referencing that datum throughout. Engineers like to do things in inches, and architects and others like to do, engineers like to do things in tenths of a foot. Architects and the general public typically like to do things in inches. So I'm trying to convert on, as you saw with the public meeting presentation, we kind of had them both on there and we tried to carry that forward here. So 1 inch is about 0.08 feet and 0.1 feet or a tenth of a foot is about 1.2 inches. So we're going to talk a lot about 10 CFS, and then we get lots of questions on, okay, well, that's fine and dandy, but what does that actually mean? So you can see the cube there, that cube, that's 2.15 feet all the way around. You do the math, that's going to be 10 cubic feet per second. Okay, well, what does that mean? So in real world terms, most people can understand and picture a culvert. So I included this diagram. If you had a 24-inch culvert on a typical slope of about 0.5%, as that culvert's, right at full, not under pressure, the capacity of that culvert's going to be right in the ballpark of 10 cubic feet per second. So if you picture that, and if you look at the future photos and the diagrams that we have in there, and you picture that amount of water in that culvert being added to the system, that will hopefully help you visualize what that impact is going to be and how that amount of water is going to work its way through the system. As I mentioned, in terms of gallons, 10 cubic feet per second translates to about 4,500 gallons per minute. That's what the pump is sized for. And then, we can certainly do all kinds of math in terms of how many gallons that is. I'll talk about the volume that needs to come out of the lake here in a second. So we got some questions, and I know there was some discussion at a recent work session about process and order of things. And so I wanted to kind of hit on that here. That green line there is kind of going beginning of the process to the end of the process. So feasibility study through operation. And you can see that blue line up there on the top. That's kind of where we're at with that ditch petition process. So we're still very early on. And as Cindy talked about, some of the first steps were those feasibility studies where we looked at the different options, determined the most feasible option. From there, we needed to do enough design to confirm that we can get the water from the lake to a suitable outlet, including Todd County Ditch 41. So at this point, Cindy and the others kind of went through the process. They worked with landowners and secured necessary agreements. We've had preliminary discussions with the agencies involved in the permitting process to confirm that we don't have any showstoppers. But at this point, the key component, as Cindy hit on, is can we obtain permission to use Todd County Ditch 41 as an outlet? Because if the answer there was no, as Cindy pointed out, then we have to go back to the drawing board. So from that standpoint, we need that answer before we can go back and then advance the design, which the agencies then are requesting before we submit the permit applications, and they submit those. We submit those, they act on them for final approval. Assuming that all falls into place, then we move forward with final design. We put it out for bids, assuming everything is on budget. The LID can award a contract, and then we move forward with construction. So there's definitely an order to things. And at this point, we need a decision on the ditch petition before we move forward with any further permitting or design or any related project associated components. So just a little bit more on that. We've touched on the feasibility studies, a little more on the permitting. We've worked with the DOT. They've confirmed that the project is permittable and that they can issue a permit to the LID. The DNR has been great to work with. They've reviewed the preliminary plans. Again, no showstoppers. We'll work with them on the permit process, which will include approval of the final operating plan, and we'll get into that much more here in a second. We've worked with Morrison County in terms of not only the highway department, because there will be impacts to their roadways, but we also have some zoning permissions that will be needed. We've been working through those. Again, no showstoppers. The direction we got from them was make sure you get everything squared away on the downstream end. You get that in place, come back, and we'll work through our process on the zoning. Wetlands are definitely a key component, but those wetlands or impacts and permitting are basically confined to the footprint of the construction. So everything well upstream of Todd County Ditch 41. We've had preliminary discussions with those folks. They've reviewed our delineations and approved those. And at this point, again, after the petition is hopefully approved, we'll be able to move forward with design. At that point, we'll submit those plans along with our proposed mitigation efforts, and those agencies then will review that and hopefully approve it. But we can't take that step until we have the ditch petition resolved. So again, we went through this at the public informational meeting, but I want to just kind of give everybody an overview of how the water gets from the lake to ditch 41. Although that's really not of the purview of the petition, because that's basically tied to the capacity, which is independent of how the water gets there. But I think it is important to provide everybody with some background and context to that. So from that standpoint, and Chris, I'm going to probably do some pointing here. So if you can follow with the cursor, that would be great. So the upper right-hand corner of this map is the westerly edge of Lake Chamino. The proposal is to have a gravity intake pipe that extends out into the lake in this vicinity. That gravity pipe will flow and bend and come down to the curve in Aztec Road. And at that location, we have a filter and a pump system. That pump will lift the water up, push it through the filter. That filter will remove the aquatic invasive species and take that filtered debris and those species and put it back into Lake Chamino. And only the clean water will move downstream through the force main, which follows Aztec Road and then continues to follow the easterly edge of US Highway 10. Again, we've been working with the DOT on that, and we should be good to go on that standpoint. From there, you can see Chris's cursor there. That will be the outlet structure, which will discharge the water into the recently cleaned out ditch there that I guess is referred locally as the Blue Line Ditch. There won't be any further improvements to that waterway, and the water will flow down that channel. And as it gets to Atlantic Road, we are constructing a bypass that will take that 10 CFS out of that natural system and take it around those property owners there where that natural waterway that Chris is tracing. So that only natural water will go down that natural waterway. The project water will come down that green line there, which is the bypass channel, and that discharges back into the tributary where we once again have landowner agreements. That tributary discharges into Fish Trap Creek, and the creek then flows down to the railroad where the creek becomes Todd County Ditch 41. So, and that's where we pick up with the discussion on the petition. So again, key features, we've talked about it a lot. The pump discharge rate is a maximum of 10 cubic feet per second. This is a balance between the downstream capacity and lowering the lake down as quickly as possible. There were other projects that were looked at and proposed with higher flow rates through discussions with agencies and property owners and various stakeholders. The LID looked at that and struck this balance with 10 cubic feet per second, and that's the focus of the project and the focus of the petition. As Artis hit on, the One Watershed, One planning effort is underway. They've discussed high water issues on lakes like Lake Chamino, and it sounds like those types of projects are likely to be included as a goal with that planning effort. And as we've also discussed, the lake is part of the watershed for not only the Long Prairie River, but the way it gets to the Long Prairie River is through Fish Trap Creek and Todd County Ditch 41. So we wouldn't be moving water from a different watershed into the Todd County Ditch 41 watershed. That's its natural watershed if it were ever to get high enough to overflow that way. And so again, as John hit on, what the LID is really asking to do here is to utilize the excess capacity in Todd County Ditch 41. And through the operating plan and the pump controls, that simplifies the answer to the question of whether the ditch has capacity or not. So we'll still go through that here, and then we'll talk in detail about proposed conditions in the operating plan. In terms of anticipated operating period, the calculations that were done to help guide the LID in their decision-making to choose that 10 CFS operating rate assumed about a 9-month operating period every year. That accounts for restrictions that would be put in the operating plan, as we'll discuss. We also know there'll be times where there are maintenance requirements and needs, And then if, it looks like it's going to rain 2 days from now or something, it may not make sense to start it up and then have to shut it right back down. So all those things will weigh into it. The assumption is we'll get about 9 months out of it. At the time we did those calculations, the lake was higher, and it looked like 3 to 4 years. I looked at the most recent reading, which was taken last week, and it looks like the lake is down maybe 0.8 of a foot or something in that neighborhood. So there's about 900 million gallons of water, of excess water in the lake. I know that's been a question. So that's much less than what was in there a year ago. So we're probably looking closer to that 3-year range of an anticipated period where the lid would need to move water through the ditch system. And then periodically after that, if the lake were to bounce at all. So some more key features. We've talked about the AIS. I mentioned the filter. Again, no AIS will be transferred downstream. We've looked at the water quality in the lake. It's very good. It should help water quality conditions downstream. We've mentioned the flowage and construction agreements with the landowners between the outlet of the force main and Todd County Ditch 41. And again, the point of the petition here is to secure permission to use the ditch as the outlet. And then the key point here is the operating plan is the crux of the whole discussion. So, we've established that it has capacity, and now it's just defining when it does and how much and what are the associated conditions of moving that water through the system. So let's dig into the operating plan, and we'll kind of talk about it in general. Then I'll get into some of the brief technical components, and then we're going to circle back at the end to specific criteria in the operating plan. So what is an operating plan? It's an actual formal document. It dictates when the pump can be turned on, including specific criteria for ditch 41. It'll dictate when the pump must be turned off, again, including specific criteria for ditch 41. And then it will dictate where the conditions need to be monitored and how frequently they need to be monitored and who will be doing the monitoring and who needs to be notified and all those details. So the board has been provided with a draft, and we'll kind of talk about that. And I know we just received some input from County Engineer Fellbaum, so we appreciate that, and we'll definitely reflect that in the next draft. And we'll talk about the process for moving from draft to final here. It's important, right? This is the whole point of interaction and coming out of the hearing and further discussions is working together to put appropriate and reasonable and acceptable conditions into the operating plan that will govern the operation of the project. So key points here. The lid cannot arbitrarily change the operating plan in the future. The DNR is going to make this operating plan a condition of their permit, but they've told us that anything that impacts Todd County Ditch 41 is going to be up to the county and the drainage authority. So they're going to wait to receive your input. They're going to confirm with you that you agree with those conditions. And if there are any future updates, they're not going to allow those unless the county signs off on it. Again, I mentioned this, the template we're using is a plan that was used for other projects, specifically in Otter Tail County. It's intended to be simple, but it's proven to be effective. So we're not going to, break something that isn't broken there. It's a good, effective plan, and it's proven to work. So in simple terms here, the operating plan dictates when the pumps are on and when they're off, and the lid has to comply with that. And simply put here, if the ditch does not have capacity, the lid will not operate the pump. If the ditch does have capacity, the lid might operate the pump if other conditions are met and if there's a need to operate it. Okay, simple terms. That's the crux of the whole thing. The rest of this stuff just helps go to identify and further define those points. A key question we get is, is the lid guaranteed they're going to be able to operate their pump? No. Okay, I want to stress that. So the operating plan does not guarantee that the lid will be able to operate their pump. Even if the homes are flooding out and roads are underwater, if the conditions in the operating plan can't be met, they cannot run their pump. The lid understands that. They have wrestled with that risk. They understand that risk, but this is their best and, quite frankly, probably only option is to go this route. And so they're taking that risk on and they're going to live with those conditions. So some more on the operating plan. Again, we want the county's input on this, And we provided the draft. We'll solicit input. We'll work through that, for as long as it takes. Hopefully we can get this wrapped up pretty quickly. One question we had was notification. The lid who will be operating the pumps will certainly notify the county. We can work out those details as to who is notified, how they are notified, all those things. We'll take your input and we'll incorporate it into the plan. As we talked about, the operating plan will be a condition of the DNR permit. Again, they are going to rely heavily on input from the county. And another key feature here is because it's tied to the permit, if the lid does not operate the project in conformance with the operating plan, they are at risk of having their permit suspended or revoked, such that they couldn't use their project. So, they're not going to invest millions of dollars in a project and then improperly operate it and have it sitting in mothballs because they, didn't operate in conformance with the operating plan. So that's the teeth in it. That's additional protection for the county and the landowners, is that they've got that hanging over their head in terms of the teeth requiring them to operate in conformance with the plan. All right, now we're locked up. There we go. All right, some additional key points. So when we start talking about the plan and we talk about capacity and we're talking about when the ditch is full and when it isn't, those are the types of things we want to specify in that plan. So there's no arguing or no subjective discussions about when it's full and when it's not. And that's what we want to get hammered out as best we can ahead of time here. And that's what we want the county's input on. We've talked about monitoring. On the right is an example of a staff gauge. That could be one of the examples that we would install at certain locations. Box culverts and bridges are great places to attach gauges like this that we can mount on there. They hopefully don't get wiped out by high flows and debris and ice and those types of things. Another thing that I like to do is etch a line in there on the concrete and paint that etch. And then, if the paint wears off in a year or two, we got that etched mark in there. We go back and paint it again. Big bright red, everybody can see it. The lid can see it, the county can see it, the landowners can see it, the general public can see it, and everybody knows where we're at in terms of that critical elevation at each spot. So we'll talk more about that here in detail. We do have what we call primary gauges, which are generally at publicly accessible locations like road crossings. And then we're proposing some secondary gauges, which are generally located on private property to help us manage specific criteria that are in some of the agreements that the lid has with landowners. Another key feature here is what we're proposing is that the monitoring of the system will occur with more frequency as water levels rise and approach the critical elevation. So, if we had conditions like we've had recently and the ditch is down low, adding 10 CFS is not going to raise the water levels anywhere close to full capacity. So we would monitor it less frequently as proposed in the plan. If water comes up a few feet, we definitely want to keep a closer eye on it. And so we would be monitoring that on a more frequent basis. And we'll discuss that more here in a second. So getting into a couple specifics, again, proposed monitoring locations, our primary gauges, again, we're trying to identify public roadways as good options for those. So starting from the upper end, we're looking at Pulaski Road, Quicken Road, and then downstream at County Road 28. We've looked at potentially adding something up near the railroad bridge, but access there is a bit of an issue. We've kind of begun discussions with the railroad to see what we can do there. But if we can't put it on the bridge, we can work with some of the landowners there, hopefully. But the good news is that due to the slope of the ditch and the analysis that we've done, we can handle the monitoring that location at Pulaski Road, and we don't have to have a gauge at the railroad to help manage the system here. Again, we've talked about notification. The plan also includes considerations for weather and seasonal climate conditions like spring runoff. So we'll be using available forecasts for the river and other streams to help guide the operation of the system and the need for monitoring. And another key feature here is I talked about that blue line ditch that's upstream. That ditch is much, much smaller than Todd County Ditch 41. So we've got restrictions on that ditch based on agreements with landowners. So that's probably going to be our limiting factor on whether we can move water with the pump or not. We've got to get through that bottleneck before we can get down to Todd County Ditch 41. So there's kind of some additional protection there, so to speak, in terms of water coming down the system into Todd County Ditch 41. So where are we at in the process? I know there were questions on this in terms of the draft operating plan. We worked with the LID to prepare an initial draft of the plan. Again, we used a template from the operating plan for the Little McDonald and Devil's Lake project in Otter Tail County. We addressed specifics for this project. We took that and met with the DNR and, got their input in terms of format and content and general, conditions from their standpoint. Again, they had said, look, this is all great, but you're going to need Todd County's input on the ditch. So we took the DNR comments, created an updated draft. We waited to get input from the public and the Drainage Authority at the public meeting held on June 1st. So we incorporated those comments and that input into an updated draft and provided that to the county here recently. We were looking for, eventually here the feedback on the triggers and what the conditions would be in there to help facilitate the discussion. We took our updated modeling results, which I'll talk about in a second, and we came up with proposed trigger elevations and put those into the document. So again, to help facilitate the discussion, we put those in there. We fully appreciate any further discussion the county wants to have on that. So I know for the board, your packets included a version called version 4 that did not have the trigger elevations in it. We've updated it to version 5, and we provided you with the 2 pages that have changed, and those are now inserted into your packet. So when we take any additional feedback we get here tonight or in the coming week or so, we'll update another version and get everything and get the version control taken care of that way. So that's where we're at now, as we're at the county input stage. As we've talked about, eventually it needs to be finalized through the DNR process. But at that point, once we get final conditions from the county, those aren't going to change, and nothing in the plan that would impact Todd County Ditch 41 are going to change. The only things that would change would be potential contact information or adding maps, or again, anything that changes is not going to impact Todd County Ditch 41. So I'll talk about that here as we circle back at the end. We'll also talk about future updates if there are any. So just in some more detail here, this is more detail that I just walked through. So I'm going to kind of roll through this. Again, DNR approval, we're looking at that happening when we submit the permit, hopefully this fall. And I just want to kind of highlight, again, the changes that would be made after you set the conditions and you agree to the draft operating plan. Any changes after that are not going to affect Todd County Ditch 41. In terms of future updates, again, I want to stress the LID cannot arbitrarily change the plan. They will need to get approval from the DNR, and the DNR is committed that they aren't going to agree to changes to Ditch 41 or changes that would impact Ditch 41 without Todd County's approval. But as we go forward, as the years go by, we certainly recognize we may need to change contact information and those types of things. And those are the types of updates that could be made without providing input, but we would certainly include you in the process. So Kurt, how are we doing?
Good.
Okay.
I said 2 hours is when people say that's enough. So we're an hour and 5. I think if we broke it right now, we'd lose continuity. So,
okay.
But the restrooms, we maybe didn't say that. Restrooms are right over there. If somebody needs to get up and stretch or stand in the back to move, but let's keep moving unless the board feels different.
Good to go? All right. So again, we'll get back to the operating plan here after a bit. Nancy covered some of the details on Ditch 41, so I won't go into this in too much detail. The maps on the left, the map on the left there is a map that Nancy provided that shows what the county has determined to be the current extents of the main ditch and the laterals. And I think it added up to over 12 miles total. The main ditch is about 6.5 miles long itself. The original plans actually that on this slide look much different. There were other areas that were included that aren't part of the ditch system now. And I think Nancy mentioned it originally was going to be over 22 miles or something like that. So it's kind of interesting from that standpoint. The map on the right is the ditch system, and those shaded boxes there are the benefiting properties that are part of the ditch system. So originally constructed in 1916, it was designed with varying ditch slopes and with varying ditch bottom widths. The laterals were designed typically to enter the main ditch at elevations typically a couple feet higher than the main ditch. The watershed area, again, which includes Lake Shamana, to that upper end there is about 81 square miles, so it's a pretty significant amount of water. It's also taken the Fish Trap Creek, which is taking base flows out of Fish Trap Lake in that system. So as Nancy mentioned, it appears that there's minimal documented maintenance that has been done, with the exception of beaver dam removal and trapping throughout the system. I know there's been discussion on a potential clean out of the ditch. I think it's important to note that a clean out can only be done to the original condition. And anything beyond that is an improvement that would then be subject to current permitting and regulatory requirements. So that's definitely going to be a challenge at best and probably impossible in reality. So we can certainly look at, future maintenance, but as I'll talk about here, we don't, in our opinion, need to do maintenance in order to accommodate the flows from the project. Any maintenance that is done would just provide additional capacity and allow, more water to move through the system, but it's not a necessity to get that done before any water comes in from the lake. Let's talk a little bit about current conditions. So I mentioned this at the previous public meeting. We did do a drone flight of the main ditch alignment back in November of 2020. Kind of the key points there were beaver dams at that point in kind of three general pockets, the upper end and in the middle, and then in the downstream kind of section through Bruce Hudala's in that area. After the public meeting that was held on June 1st, the LID and I met and we talked about some of the questions and concerns that were raised. They authorized us to go out and collect additional information and further refine our modeling and our analysis of the ditch. So we sent a crew up there. I can tell you those guys were not happy. I know one of them picked off 22 ticks just in one day. And they were trudging through a lot of muck, and I know Nancy can testify some of that peat is pretty nasty. So I got to give kudos to our guys for doing that. The LID kind of helped us coordinate the access for that, and I appreciate those landowners for allowing us to access the ditch for that work. The good news was we found fewer beaver dams. I know particularly on the upstream end, it looked like a lot of those were gone, and I know in the middle as well. The dams are either gone or they had been manipulated such that they weren't holding back as much water. So that was good. In general, I think we found the ditch to be in pretty good shape. And the culverts, those three primary culverts were all in solid shape. They're all concrete structures. So we did identify some scour holes at various locations, which is kind of interesting. So the ditch is deeper in some spots just due to scour. The main ditch drops 22 feet from the upstream end down to County Road 28. The interesting thing is if you look at those original design plans, that indicates the drop at that time was supposed to be closer to 14 or 15 feet. So I guess over 100 years of water flowing through that system has led to some down cutting and erosion in the system, and it's actually deeper and steeper in some locations at this point. So that's also something to keep in mind as we talk about a clean out and, going back to original conditions. In a lot of locations, the ditch is actually deeper and wider than what the original condition was. So there's more capacity now than there was 100 years ago. I don't think there's any surprise in terms of the laterals. I think we've talked about that many of them are overgrown and obstructed. In talking with Nancy earlier tonight, it sounds like they've worked with other county personnel to do some drone flights recently of some of the laterals, and taking a look at those and identifying what's going on there. And I'll talk more about the laterals here in a second. We've talked about erosion that was brought up, particularly on the downstream end. I don't think it's any coincidence that the erosion is prevalent in that lower end where the channel has cut down after decades and decades of flow. So as that channel dropped down, those banks got steeper. probably a product of the soil types down there as well. We have accounted for that in our recommendations though, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Similar slide to what we showed at the public meeting. This includes a link to the drone flight. I'm not gonna play the video. It would take 20 minutes to go from top to bottom. But if there are specific questions, we can certainly bring this up to address any particular concerns. So a couple key points with this map. I think this one might be one of your handouts. As we talked about in the project route overview, the water is going to enter Fish Trap Creek, which then becomes Todd County Ditch 41 at the railroad crossing there. So we've identified that in the map as the point where the water would enter the ditch. It's going to flow down the main ditch and be contained in the main ditch. It won't be flowing through the laterals or breaking out into the floodplain. We'll be using the main ditch to get all the way from the railroad down to the Long Prairie River. And then in addition to the laterals not being used, we're also not going to be adding flow at the top end of the, what I call the old creek loop there at Quicken Road, where I'll point it out here. So this is the original creek channel. There were no improvements that were done to that as part of the original ditch project. There's a culvert through 311th Avenue here. And that is, that bottom of that culvert is higher than what we're proposing to set for the maximum operating level with the pumps running. So we wouldn't be pushing any water to the west there. And we'll get into more detail on that here in a second. So this map again is to more or less just kind of show the extent of the ditch. I brought this in just to address any questions that might come up. So as we've talked about, the crux of the discussion here with this petition is whether or not the ditch has capacity. And the simple and direct answer to that is yes. And we can state that for the following reasons. We've done channel surveys, we've done some hydraulic modeling, and we've observed the ditch visually, but it comes down to that operating plan. So you can look at the photos there, you can see, how deep the water is in there. And through that operating plan and the controls of the pump, we know that we can limit adding flows only to times when there is sufficient capacity in the ditch. So from here, then, we really just need to focus on the conditions in the operating plan to make sure that that operating plan addresses any limitations that are required to ensure that that's the case. So I want to just talk about hydraulic modeling because we are going to talk about the model. In terms of the operating plan, the pump and the plan are dictated by actual conditions in the ditch, not the model. So we can talk about the modeling and we can look at the details of that model and you can get second and third opinions on that. But as I say here, the proof is in the pudding, right? We're going to look at the actual ditch at our monitoring locations and we're going to look at those conditions and we're going to look and say, is it full or not? If it's full, the pumps aren't on. And if it's not, the pumps might run. That's what it boils down to. Now, we do have a model. That model should be looked at as a tool. And we can use it to help with the monitoring and the operation, but the real world conditions in the ditch are going to control the operation of the system. That's a key point. I want to make sure we stress that. I also want to point out that as the conditions are finalized, the lid's going to have to look at that. And as we talked about their risk in the operation here and investing in the capital side of things to build the project, based on those conditions, do they feel like they're going to get enough capacity and operation time to pump water? That's for them where the model will be helpful because they can look at it and say, okay, based off of past and recent conditions, the model tells us that, yeah, we think we can get 9 months of operation and that we think we can get our lake down in 3 years as assumed. So again, really that's the importance of the model. I don't think that we need to get too far into the weeds with that discussion in terms of the operating plan, but I do want to go through it because it is a tool that could be used if there's a desire to use it. So another key point here, when we say, does the ditch have capacity? And the answer is yes. I want to stress that that's based off of existing conditions. So that's based off of the survey data that we collected on June 17th and 18th, and also back into April. Those are the conditions that are reflected in the model and in the diagrams that you're going to see. If the ditch was cleaned out, the conditions would get better, anything beyond normal beaver dam removal. So conditions would improve, but it's not necessary to do those cleanouts in order to realize any of the capacity that we're talking about the lid potentially using. So to stress that, clean out would provide additional capacity potentially, but it's not necessary to pursue that before adding water from the lids project. Again, I've noted some photos here. You can see the dates on those and the locations there. We'll see some more of these types of photos here in a second with some more diagrams. So this is where you might recognize some of these slides from before. When we talk about hydrology, we're talking about the quantity of water, and then that transitions into hydraulics, which is how that quantity of water moves through the system. So we went into a lot of detail on this during the public informational meeting because at that point, we were still talking about whether the ditch had capacity or not. At this point, as we've talked about, we've established the answer to that is yes. And we're now moving into the conditions phase. So while this is all still relevant and important, it's not critical to the discussion. So I'm not going to go into quite as much detail. Again, it's here to be on the record, and I can certainly address this, but it's not critical to the discussion here. So with that, this is a diagram. This goes back to the original ditch petition back in March. From here, the lid has continued to provide additional information to support their petition and further refined the analysis. So we made some assumptions, for example, at this location that the water was 3 feet deep when we started to pump. With the modeling we've done now, we know what a starting condition is. And so you'll see a slightly different example of this, but the short answer to the story is the results don't change significantly. And what we're finding is that even as we refine the models, add more detail, we're still getting the same answer. It's just a refined answer with a higher level of confidence, so to speak. So again, the hydrology component of the analysis that we're working with at this point is not critical, and I'm going to explain that as we go forward. There are existing models that are out there, and we are using those as a basis. For example, FEMA and the DNR have a model of Todd County Ditch 41, but they're using that for floodplain management, and they're looking at the water that's going out in the overbanks and flooding fields and roads and those types of things. We're looking more at, obviously, the flow in that lower channel, the primary channel, which those models don't have a lot of detail on. So that's why we went out, collected more survey data to supplement these models. Okay, a lot of information here. We went through this at the last meeting. So as we talk about the quantity of water, fortunately, the government through the United States Geological Survey has a nice website called StreamStats. Anybody here can go there and you can start clicking anywhere in the watershed. And as long as you click on a waterway that they have identified, it'll tell you what the various estimated flow rates are for different recurrence events. So again, a 2-year event, that doesn't mean it happens every 2 years. That actually means it's a 50% chance. So, do the math and flip the fraction over. It's a 50% chance on any given year. Okay, so what's the significance of this? The point I want to make is a 2-year event in the stream correlates to about a 2.6-inch rainfall. And when you factor in the portion of that getting soaked into the ground and some of it evaporating, the net result at the upper end of the ditch is 95 CFS, okay? 95 cubic feet per second. We're talking about adding 10 cubic feet per second. So we're roughly 10% of the flow at that rate. Now, the bottom point is another key point here is when engineers and scientists talk about bank full capacity, that's the maximum amount of water that a channel can contain before it spills out and floods in the overbank. Typically, what's been found over years and years of analysis is that, especially in a case like this where the water's been flowing through here for 100 years, it's very predictable what a system's going to do in response to that flowing water. And typically what we see is that the bank full discharge typically corresponds to about a 2-year event, somewhere around a 1.5 year to a 2-year event. Okay, why do I say this? Because this gives us confidence that when our model is showing us that roughly 100 cubic feet per second can go through that channel before it spills out, that hits exactly with what industry guidance says in terms of that bank full capacity. So it gives us a lot of confidence in the models. you may recall at the June 1st meeting, we talked about measurements. The lid has had folks going around and measuring down from these culverts to get depths. That helps us calibrate our model. It also helps us convey kind of in real world terms what the impacts of the project are going to be. And you may recall seeing some of those examples. I have some updated examples we'll go through here in a second. Rating curves. Okay, so simple terms, we plug in assumed flows. We run those through the model and we look at the results. And that helps us identify at what point, for example, the water starts to break out of the channel, or at what flow rate a certain culvert might get inundated. And then we can focus the rest of our efforts after that. All right, locked up again. I'm going to take that as a sign I can get a drink of water.
How much more do you have?
Let me see.
I'm thinking, Madam Chair, if it's all right with the chair, it's about 6-minute break. If we take a break till 8:30, just to stretch our backs, and if is that all right?
Yes.
Madam Chair? So we'll commence again at 8:30, which is about 6 minutes from now, just to stretch a little bit.
Practicing your golf game.
So.
You were the ace. He's got 2 bringers. Oh, is that what he brings? He brings in a couple guys that are real shooters. Yeah, let's see how tonight goes. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
We have plenty of evidence to establish.
Right.
But it's also steeper, so we might have 24. So.
Stick around. I cannot imagine that. I always make the joke that I have a lot of public lands and in-house IT for people. They always have a different way of presenting. Yeah, I can't describe it other than it can be boring. I started it last night. Came in this morning at 6 and I started. We know diamonds are formed
And then you
So you did, do you have another one? I thought Rick got one, but I.
Sure, now this is Metro. Really not. No, they were absolutely. They would- they would
I only did the Metro, so.
No, it's, technically, you can't, you know, even like that. I would have more from that. Oh, the handout. There's the original handout. Thanks.
Hey, stranger, how are you?
See if I can. Okay. All right. Okay, I'll try to do better, and if you can't hear me, I'll have Chris put it through.
All right, I think we're gonna start again.
I had some folks mention that, so I told them I tried to stay. Yeah, I got the same folks right.
All right, everybody will take their seat.
Put your lights down, guys.
We'll get started again. Talking to the chair, I have no idea how long it's gonna go tonight with questions and comments, but there is going to be a point tonight, whether it's 9:30 or there's a point tonight where we just won't keep going till midnight. I don't want, just so you know that we're not going until it's an unreasonable time. I have no idea. The chair will decide that, but we'll see where we go from here.
All right, welcome back. I had some comments that I'm hard to hear. I think I'm wandering from the mic. So I told those folks that if I wander away to wave, and Kurt will get my attention, and I'll chain myself here. So with that, where we left off, we were just starting a discussion on the modeling, which I'm sure is everybody's favorite topic here. But a few key points. So we had talked about modeling at the June 1st meeting. As I mentioned, the LID sent us out with a mission to collect more data and refine our model. So we did that. The good news is that the results of that are that we came out of it with a model that calibrated very well to the conditions that we saw out there on June 17th and 18th. So again, that gives us a lot of confidence that this tool is reliable and we can utilize it as we move forward here. So with that, I'm going to talk through the process here a little bit. So a key component of the analysis and how we'll determine what the maximum operating level will be is, exactly what is the capacity of that channel. So a couple of key examples I want to point out as we talk about critical bank elevations. The photo on the left is from the downstream reach, I think on Smiths and Bartles down in that neck of the woods. Again, this is the reach that eroded. I think what we're seeing here is you can see that upper flat area. The ditch was originally cut through that, and then it's dropped over the last 100+ years. And that's why we're seeing that erosion on the side. We're not proposing to run any of the lid's water up into that erosion area. For those that are close enough to see, and I'll try to trace it here, I've got a red line drawn. That's the point that we identified as the critical bank elevation in that location. So when we look at the profile here in a second, you'll see some red crosses. That correlates to that. So that's that primary bank that we're looking to convey water in, and we're not looking to go higher than that. Similarly, if you go upstream, I believe that photo on the upper right is just upstream of Quicken Road. So we're kind of in a flatter section there. There's not as much erosion, obviously, apparent there. Again, I've got the red line, and Chris will help me trace that. You can kind of see there, that's what we determined to be the critical elevation that we want to maintain pumped water conditions below that. Anything above that, the pumps will be off. So we did that throughout the system on all of our surveyed cross sections. And then that's what's reflected in this profile. So for those at the public meeting, you'll maybe recognize this profile. I'm going to do a better job. I had some requests to kind of explain this better. So the bottom here, this dashed dotted line, that's the channel bottom that we surveyed June 17th and 18th. You'll notice it's pretty uneven. It goes up and down. You can kind of see some of the scour holes. But the good news is that the ditch drops from the upper end to the lower end, and we're moving water through the system. It's likely deeper and considerably deeper in a lot of locations than that original condition. So there's likely more capacity in much of the system than there was 100 years ago. Some of the other dots then. So the red dots or red crosses here, those are those critical bank elevations that we identified throughout the system. So again, that's going to be our target that we want to make sure that we maintain our what we're calling our maximum operating level below that. The dashed dotted lines, or sorry, just the dotted lines up here are profiles taken on either side of the ditch 50 feet from the center line. So that's out in the overbank area. Again, we're not planning to flow, any pumped water out in that area, but this gives us an idea on kind of the topography out there, and so to speak, what's the risk if the water did go out beyond that. So it's a point of reference, but the key here are those red dots that are showing up and down the system. There are also some other points here, and I'm going to kind of point them out. I think they're blue for those that can see it. Those are the laterals. So as we talked about, the laterals were typically designed to come in above the channel bottom elevation, and in a lot of cases that's true, but we're also seeing that a lot of those laterals have cut, at least at the lower end, down to match the current elevation of the main ditch. So that is something we've also factored into the analysis and the proposed operation. But just to jump to the conclusion there, we aren't seeing any issues in terms of capacity on the laterals as a result of adding water within the maximum operating level that we're going to talk about. One last point on this slide, I alluded to this earlier, but the culvert through 311th Avenue, that's near Quicken Road, near that intersection. That's where the old creek loops out and around. That's the upper end of that. That 18-inch culvert controls how much water leaves the main ditch and goes over into that loop. You can see it's considerably higher than the bottom of the ditch channel. And again, just as we're using these red marks, we're also using that culvert as a controlling factor to make sure when we're using the pump, the water isn't going to be above that culvert. So we're not going to push water over to that old creek loop. So as I talked about, we surveyed those channel features. As we went through the system, we also surveyed the water surface elevations. throughout the system so that, so that we obviously knew what it was, but then we can also take it to our model and say, all right, we've updated our model. How well does it predict what we're actually seeing out there? And that's what this next slide indicates. So I recognize this may be hard to see in the back. The point here is that it's difficult to tell the difference because the lines actually correlate very, very closely, particularly in this reach between Quicken Road up to the upper end, which is what you'll see in a second here was kind of the critical reach for setting the maximum operating levels. It coincides with the slope in that area. It's much flatter. You're seeing that's kind of the limiting factor when it comes to the capacity of the system. So the good news here then, this gives us confidence. There are some differences I'll point out. Some of those are attributed to potentially beaver dams, which I know have been moved. But that's not a critical component of the model. What we were shooting for was a strong calibration in this reach, and that's what we saw. So what does all that mean then? Well, we can look at that profile and say, all right, real world conditions, the water elevations we surveyed on the 17th and 18th, obviously it's dry. I think most people recognize that the water levels are relatively low. What would happen if the project was constructed and it was operating on that date? Again, I recognize this is difficult to see from the back, but that's kind of the point. Those two profile lines are basically right on top of each other. So the impact, I'm going to jump ahead here into a different format, which might be easier to see. Again, same two profiles, surveyed condition water level on June 17th and 18th. That's the blue line there at Pulaski Road on the left and Quicken Road on the right. You can see photos down below. You can see the correlation there on the depth in those photos and that blue depth on the upper graphics. If the pump was running on that day and adding 10 cubic feet per second, the depth would have been just up to the red line there. So at Pulaski, it would have been 3.5 inches. And at Quicken Road, it would have been 2.4 inches. So some of you might be saying, I thought you've been telling us that the difference was 2 inches. Well, it depends on the scenario. Here, we're talking about lower conditions. So as we add 10 CFS, that's a greater percentage of the total flow. In this case, 10 CFS would be more like 25% of the total flow. When we're looking at the higher flow, we're going to get to in a second. And as I mentioned earlier, that 10 CFS is more like 10% of the total flow. And so the corresponding difference is thus lower. And so again, real world conditions, the hope here is that people can better visualize this if they've been out there and they've looked at the conditions here in the last couple of weeks. You've seen how much water's in the ditch. You can add 3.5 inches at Pulaski and about 2.5 inches at Quicken and get an idea on what the conditions are going to be if the pump were to be running when the water is at those elevations. So again, a couple more examples. This is just another one down at the downstream end. Again, not much depth here going through here. I think the velocities are much higher. That's why you're not seeing a lot of depth. And down there, due to the shape of the culvert, there's an increase of, I think, what's that, 5.4 inches or somewhere in that neck of the woods. So plenty of capacity there, though, if water would have been moving from the lake project through the ditch system at that location. So again, we've talked about this numerous times throughout the presentation. After establishing that the ditch has the capacity, the next step is to work towards the conditions and setting the maximum operating level and the associated triggers and monitoring locations in the operating plan. So we used the model we've been talking about as a guide. Again, I want to reiterate, actual operating conditions are going to be based on the actual conditions that are observed in the ditch. But this is, again, a tool that helps us set those guidelines and provides us a tool to use to track water levels in between those monitoring locations. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got these red critical bank elevations up and down the system, and we don't want our water elevation to exceed that. So we ran various, as I mentioned earlier, rating curves through the model and identified a curve that closely hit those red lines or red dots, but didn't exceed them. And you'll notice, I think this was the critical one here, downstream of Pulaski Road. Again, we're seeing the effects of the flatter ditch section through there. That became the critical kind of controlling location. And so we said, all right, this looks like a reasonable profile to kind of use as our basis to pull out those trigger elevations to then include in the draft operating plan and help with the discussion. So again, we feel it's reasonable. It addresses the concerns over the capacity of the ditch. As you'll notice in a lot of locations, this proposed operating plan is actually well below the critical elevation. So there's, additional capacity and additional freeboard there. And really this controlling factor is here at Pulaski Road. So I did a couple zoom ins on this particular one just to kind of help with that. So you can see again, the lower end down here, Bartles and Smiths in that area, that channel, as you can see with these dotted lines, that channel, the full channel is very deep, but we're not looking to utilize that full channel. We've identified that lower channel. If you recall that picture with the grass and that defined channel down there, that's what that correlates to. That'll be an important point when we talk about erosion. So again, you can work up and down the system. You'll notice the laterals. I know there's questions on the laterals. Yes, they show to be coming in lower, but the proposed operating profile is not going to negatively impact the capacity of those laterals. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So moving to the upstream section, again, just a closer look. Here you get a better look at that critical elevation, a couple of these where we're still below those critical bank elevations. So again, just some pictorials here at that maximum operating level. At the upstream end at the railroad, if we were at that level, the water would be about 2.8 feet deep. And of that depth, if the pump was running, just 2 inches would be attributed to that 10 cubic feet per second. So again, correlates very closely to all the analysis that we've done throughout the process. So nothing new or totally an outlier. Everything is consistent, and we have great confidence in those numbers. Pulaski Road, similarly, the total depth at that maximum operating profile will be 3.7, of which at 10 CFS, the lid's water, so to speak, would be about 1.7 inches of that total depth. So pretty minimal from that standpoint. Quicken Road, similar story, about 1.7 inches of the total 2.7 feet. And then downstream at County Road 28, you're at about 2.8 feet of depth, and about 1.3 inches of that would be attributed to the 10 cubic feet per second. So pretty minimal all the way through the system. So we've looked at the culverts because those are easy to visualize and people can drive by and see those. I wanted to include some additional information. So we picked some cross sections at representative points up and down the system. So these are identified here at the top of each graph. So the one on the left is 50 feet upstream of Pulaski Road. So what we're seeing here is the surveyed channel geometry with overbank areas developed from LiDAR topography. Again, we're not going to be putting water up in these overbank areas. The key is that maximum operating profile is still well below the top of the channel there. Likewise, as we go downstream, this is by the private crossing in section 15. I believe that Bruce Dita put in. You can see there we're still well within the bank. And same story as we go all the way through. So we're at Quicken Road, upstream and downstream here. Moving downstream, we've got the private bridge, I believe, at Bartles. You can see the maximum operating level there. Again, in this area, we're seeing that downcut channel that has eroded over the last 100 years, probably. All right, and I'm locked up again, so I'll give it a second. Okay, so as I promised, we're going to talk a little bit about laterals. Our surveys and our modeling did not identify any issues in terms of capacity on the laterals. We did identify, and this is no secret here, I think that they could definitely benefit from a clean out, but those clean outs aren't necessary to account for any flows from the proposed project or to address any potential impacts. So those people I know would definitely benefit from cleanouts, but it's not a necessity to accommodate the project in any way. We had some specific questions at the hearing or the public meeting on lateral number 3. That's shown on the right. So this is County Road 7. It flows generally northerly and joins up with the main ditch, which continues north there. We took some shots at County Road 7, and we took shots at the confluence down there in the main ditch. We found that the water level at County Road 7 was 5 feet higher than the water level in the main ditch. So it's not, the main ditch isn't backing water all the way up to County Road 7. The modeling we did indicated that if it's cleaned out, it should be much lower at County Road 7. So the conclusion there is that there are likely some obstructions in between County 7 and the main ditch. And in talking with Nancy, I think that's something that they're aware of and likely will be confirmed through some drone flights here coming up. The culvert at County Road 7 is about 4 feet higher than the bottom of the channel in the main ditch. So in a cleaned out condition, there's definitely plenty of fall there. And the modeling doesn't indicate that adding additional flow into the ditch, which again really isn't additional, it's just flow utilizing the excess capacity in there, but that flow isn't going to cause measurable negative impacts there at the County Road 7. There's also a question about that culvert. I appreciate Lauren Feldbaum looking into that. It was determined that existing culvert has a greater capacity than the previous culvert. And I guess my conclusion there is if there are issues there, they're probably also tied to obstructions that are apparently in that lateral. So the old creek loop, again, I guess that's maybe my term, but just to clarify, as we get at Quicken Road area here where the creek loops out and around, wanted to touch on a few key things here. So while that was included in the original design, it wasn't constructed, but it is the outlet for a few laterals. There's lateral here, I believe, and there's a lateral coming in here and one over there. So it is accepting water and then ultimately conveying that back to the main ditch. As I've noted, the bottom of that 18-inch culvert here at location 1 is its existing elevation is higher than what we're proposing to set for the maximum operating level. So no pumped water will be moved into that upper reach of that old channel. I know they've got some issues there, but we're certainly not looking to make those worse. And by not adding water to it, we can certainly help with that. We found that there's about 6 feet of drop from the culvert through Quicken Road down to the junction of that creek loop with the main ditch. So, water, assuming obstructions can be dealt with, there's definitely a lot of fall there to keep the water moving. But again, none of that water is going to be coming from the lids pumped system. There's some questions brought up by a property owner here near the confluence regarding, I guess, a meadow or some haying that would be desired in that location. The next slide, I just kind of want to show that. So this is a cross section that goes completely across the creek and through that meadow. And on the lower part here, you can see again, our maximum operating level is well down into the channel at that location right there. And that is about 3 and almost 4 feet lower than the kind of the average level of that meadow there. So definitely do not anticipate any adverse impacts of the project when it's operating at that maximum operating level at that location. One other point, just there were beaver dams particularly identified back in November. And so we can definitely tell from the drone footage that those dams at that time were backing water up at least as far as this confluence and probably farther. So if folks were seeing, flooding and issues back in there in recent years, a lot of that I think was attributed to beaver dams that existed in that area. Another point of interest, I guess, has been the capacity or the private crossing that was installed in section 15. It's also the Zeta crossing. I think we saw photos of that were provided at the public hearing. Just to provide some context, here's some photos. That's a 10 by 8 pipe. You can see our surveyor in there to give you some context on how big that is. On the right over here, this exhibit shows, again, the maximum operating level that we're proposing. The water would be just over 4 feet deep in that pipe, of which only, and my eyes are bad, is that 1.9? 1.9 inches of that would be attributed to the 10 CFS from the project. If we look at the water level that we surveyed on June 17th, that was way down here. It was about 2.5 feet deep. You can kind of see that on J here. If the pumps would have been running that day, we're 2 to 3 inches deeper with that 10 CFS. So again, pretty minimal impact here with the proposed operating conditions. So we've had questions on channel erosion. Again, I've talked about this. There's been a lot of erosion on that lower end. We determined that that section of the ditch down there is actually 13 times steeper than it was designed, which is pretty significant. That culvert down there at County 28 is about 6.5 feet lower than what the original plan showed it would be. So after years and years of that erosion, I think that's what's caused what we see down there and what you saw in those photos. At this point, I think that the establishment of culverts with hard bottoms instead of bridges with soft bottoms, those hard culvert bottoms have now kind of stabilized things, and it's probably kind of locked things into a more stable condition, which is good. More importantly, the potential flows from the lid project, as I showed, are not going to be running flow up into that eroded area. And even with that, the analysis shows that adding 10 CFS to our normal flow conditions down there increases the flow velocity by approximately 0.1 feet per second. So pretty minor, and it's not going to lead to additional erosion in that neck of the woods or anywhere else in the channel based on what we're seeing. I just want to talk about this. We had talked about this at the public hearing in terms of other modeling that had been done. I want to point this out. So Widseth Engineering, formerly known as WSN or Widseth Smith Nolting, they had been commissioned by Morrison County to look at a similar project with a slightly different flow rate at 3.9 cubic feet per second. Their analysis, as you can kind of see summarized here for a 2 and a 10 and 100 year, showed anticipated impacts to adding that amount of flow. If we scale that up and convert that to approximately our 10 cubic feet per second, what we're seeing is that the results are consistent, which again gives us greater confidence in the modeling that's been done. I think probably helps negate the need for further looks into this, but we can certainly have that discussion if that's desired. Now, we're kind of wrapping up the discussion on the ditch. I know there may be some questions on the Long Prairie River, so just want to cover this quickly. Again, there's a model that the DNR and FEMA have, so we kind of utilize that. In terms of the flows in the river, the LIDS project is a drop in the bucket. So we're looking at a 100-year flood, well over 2,500 cubic feet per second here in Long Prairie. With the additional watershed down there at Philbrook, it's over 5,700. Okay, we're not going to be running water when the river's flooding anyway. So let's look at more likely conditions. At a 2-year condition, which is shown on the lower right over here, the adding 10 cubic feet per second when the pump is running is going to be 1/100 of a foot, so a fraction of an inch. So that will still be addressed in the operating plan. We'll have gauges downstream on the river. We'll utilize the USGS gauge. I also want to point out that, this portion and taking the water down through the river system is something the DNR will cover. Again, we've met with them on numerous occasions. They're comfortable with the operating plan as is. They want your input on Todd County Ditch 41, but we're not going to be looking any further downstream into the Crow Wing or into the Mississippi or any of those reaches, which is consistent with every other outlet project we've done. At some point, these impacts become negligible, and particularly when we're conveying water below the ordinary high water mark, it's not subject to permitting approval, and it's not something we need to get cleared ahead of time. So we need to get the ditch petition done, and then, as I talked about, we'll go through the process of permitting and finalizing all these details. All right, so now for the 9th inning here, at least as far as the presentation. So we're back to the operating plan. So we kind of talked about some of the analysis we've done. Again, it's a tool to help us kind of provide some guidance and some information to finalize this operating plan. We'll talk about monitoring locations, water levels, monitoring frequency, and notifications. So as I talked about, the current proposal is to have primary gauges at 3 locations: Pulaski, Quicken, and County Road 28. If we can certainly have a discussion on additional gauges. Of course, anything on private property, we'll need to make sure that we have access rights for. That's kind of the ideal reason we want to use these public road crossings where possible. Here are the trigger elevations. Again, these are taken right off those diagrams I showed when we go back to that maximum operating profile. So again, as I mentioned, we provided updated sheets for the operating plan to the board this evening. That sheet reflects what we have on the screen. So the elevations in terms of sea level, probably don't mean much. Those depths are probably what would have a resonating tone for everybody. So Pulaski Road, 3.7 feet, Quicken and County Road 28, both about 2.8 feet. Again, for discussion, are there any other locations on the main ditch that there's a desire to have monitoring done? A couple of points of note on the right. I mentioned the railroad. We've had those discussions. It would be fine to put one there. I don't think it's necessary to require one there. We can address monitoring of the ditch in that reach at Pulaski Road and upstream and get a picture of what's going on in between. So some key points I just want to hit on real quickly. Again, this whole proposed maximum operating level is based on the condition that the water is contained within the main ditch channel, as we showed in the cross sections and in those culvert diagrams. As I noted, much of the ditch system has additional capacity. It's really set on that one key location just downstream of Pulaski Road. When the water levels are at that maximum operating level, the contribution from the lid pump, if it was running at that time, would be less than 2 inches throughout much of the system. So a pretty small impact from that standpoint. Water will not flow through the 311th Avenue culvert into the old creek loop. Again, we touched on that. Maximum operating levels will not adversely impact the capacity of the laterals. And just to again hit this, the DNR will require that Todd County's conditions are incorporated into the plan before they approve it. And any future changes that would impact Todd County Ditch 41 would be approved by Todd County through the DNR. So now we move on to monitoring and what's proposed in the plan. Again, kind of taken from the previous templates. As I mentioned, the monitoring will pick up frequency as the levels in the ditch get higher and get closer to that maximum operating level. So if it's greater than 5 feet below that level, our proposal is that we would look at it bi-weekly at the greatest gap in between monitoring. We would do it at least weekly if we're between 1/2 foot and 1/10 of a foot, and on a daily basis if we're within 1/10 of a foot. So again, this is a kind of a starting point. We'll take any feedback on that. I think what the modeling there also showed is that the risk of these tolerances, we're talking about as you're up to that upper level, we're talking about 2 inches. I don't want to downplay 2 inches and what that means, but that does play into the frequency of the monitoring here. It won't just be the lid monitoring. Obviously, we want those gauges, at least a sufficient number of them in public locations, so that landowners and Todd County officials and the general public can also monitor them and make sure that things are in order on the system. Notifications, I know we had a request on this, so Todd County will certainly be notified. Again, we can work out the details on who and by what means, whether if it's a phone call or an email or a text or all three. Those are certainly things that we can incorporate your input on into the final plan. Excuse me. And again, just in terms of the process, we've been through the initial draft. We've got the DNR's preliminary approval. They basically said, yep, it's an acceptable format and function at this point. You need to get Todd County's input and then come back to us with your permit and we'll finalize the process. Again, just to reiterate, nothing in that draft is going to change such that it would impact Todd County Ditch 41 before it goes final. If there were changes, we would have to come back and certainly have discussions with the county and work through that process. And we talked about future updates if they're necessary, likely to be simple things like contact information and updated maps, but any significant changes that impact the ditch are going to go through a discussion and review process with the county. Again, I included this. So for those watching or downloading this later, here's our contact information. If you want to reach out to us, I had numerous people reach out to me after the public meeting that use this information. So feel free to do so. And with that, I'm going to take a pause and get a drink. And I'm going to turn this back to John Shockley to walk us through the final approval process here.
Thank you, Mike. And I'll be brief, recognizing the late hour. The LID's position is that the evidence that we presented tonight at this hearing establishes that ditch 41 does in fact have the capacity for the project. Just to reiterate, the project will only run if there's capacity within the ditch. It's not an uncontrolled outlet into ditch 41. The lid is only going to operate the outlet during those times of low flow in ditch 41, meaning the capacity of ditch 41 will not be negatively impacted by the project. The lid is required to follow the operating plan. It's still yet to be final approval by MDNR. Otherwise, it's going to risk losing its right to discharge water into ditch 41. Because of that fact, the lid is taking the risk that the water levels in ditch 41 will permit the discharge to occur over the next 3 to 4 years. If the water levels are high, it might take longer to lower the lake level. In fact, on one of the projects they worked on, they went several months that they could not operate their pumps because the water level was higher. And so the lid understands that. The lid is taking that risk. It's a protection to the downstream property owners and to the watershed to ensure that we're not causing too much water to go into ditch 41. The discharged water is filtered and it ensures that the invasive species don't travel from the lake to ditch 41. That's a part of DNR's approval. We want to make sure that we're not spreading invasive species from the lake to the ditch. The lid is willing to work with Todd County's attorney on the development of conditions to be incorporated into the approval of our petition. And finally, on behalf of the lid, we would request that the county commission approve the lid's petition and direct Todd County's attorney to work with myself to finalize the permit conditions. And we can bring back the permit conditions to the county commission for final approval. We understand that you might still have a few comments left on the operating plan, can certainly work to incorporate those. We really see the operating plan as kind of the last key to the puzzle, so to speak, so that you can get the conditions and the notifications that you want incorporated in the operating plan. And we could certainly stand for any questions that the county commission might have.
Madam Chair, before we open it up for public comment, just to kind of set some timelines tonight or get some input, so I'm not doing something the board doesn't want to pursue as far as time. It's now 9:05. My thought or recommendation, subject to your decision, is we'd go till 9:30, see where we are, but likely if there may be a lot of comments left to do, and we'll pause at 9:30 and decide what the next step is, if that's all right with the board. It's your, is a general consensus is that there's some people here that have said the whole, I'd like to give at least 20, 25 minutes and
Absolutely.
longer if it continues to another day, but some people may only be able to be here tonight. And we'll take people in the audience first, depending where that goes. And then I know we do have people virtually that we'll take them next on any questions. So before we open it up to the public, I just want to, I personally don't like to arbitrarily say you have 1 minute, 2 minutes, but please, when you make your comments, they're all important. If it's a question, we'll try and direct it, either the petitioners will or I will, to whoever would be best to answer that. If you have comments, they're very important comments, they're on the record. But again, I'm not going to recommend any arbitrary number, but you know, if you're going after 45 minutes, well, it won't last that long. I'll stop before you go 45 minutes. But I don't want to arbitrarily, but please be attuned to the fact that there's a lot of people that may have comments. So with that, Madam Chair, unless the petitioners have anything else, we'll open it up for public comment or questions. They may have comments, they have questions, and then at 9:30, we'll see where we are and bring it back to the board to where we are tonight. So that's all right, Madam Chair, and members of the boards. All right, if you have a comment or a question, please come up to the podium, state your name and address so we know who it is on the record, and then whatever question or comments you may have, certainly make them. Yes, sir.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm Don Ogilvy. We live at 3204 Pine View Boulevard. And I'm very impressed with the process that's going on, and to think that it doesn't really affect the ditch and it can be turned off in high waters. I think that's good. I want you to know our house is not in the water, and Highway 10 will be underwater before our house goes under. So I'm not here to save the house. But you look at that beautiful lake and see 100-foot pine trees going in the water, and it's looking kind of tough in some places. And I just encourage you to vote yes on this proposal.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
My name's Peter Click. My address is 17416 Echo Drive, and I don't live anywhere near Chaminade. I'm a resident of the county. I use Chaminade. I visited Chaminade. My grandkids go to the church camp up there. And something I've noticed over the years is I've been involved in aquatic invasive species and water quality for over 20 years. And I noticed that with this high water problem they have on Chaminade, the water quality on what was probably one of the most pristine lakes in the state is declining. We got septic systems leaching in it. We got houses that are underwater that are falling apart, and the shoreline erosion is terrible. And these people on the lid have done a lot of work and put a lot of effort into making sure this plan that they can lower the water and save the lake and save their residences. And I think I encourage the board to approve this. It's, Morrison County has thrown $2,000 or $200,000 into the pot, which to me is a lot of money to help out with any ditch work that needs to be done. 74% of the residents on the lake have approved this project and approved the lid to do this. And therefore, I hope that you people on the board will approve this and that they can start lowering the water in the lake and hopefully save their lake. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Okay, well, my name is Gary Barczyk. I've got 80 acres right on ditch 41.
What's your
And-
just address, just so that
40475 North Shore. I'm right on 7 in Norris. Okay, and he had a few pictures there and he kind of discounted it, but I'll tell you what my feelings are. Well, for one thing, these engineers, they got kind of a way of talking about stuff. So he'll give you how much it'll affect at the road bridge, which is 20-some feet wide. But if you come down to our side of the creek, it's 4 and 5 feet wide. So if it's 3 inches at 24 feet, what is it at 4 and 5 feet? You gotta, look at the whole picture. But what I'm getting at is I had your highway engineer come out and we looked at the culvert, comes under County Road 7. And he poked around with a shovel and we determined that it was around 15 or 16 inches below water level in the drought time. So now you're talking about trying to pump in 4,500 gallons a minute, or, to on top of that. Well, it's going to flood me. There's just no doubt about it. I don't care what they tell me, it's going to flood me. And that's what I'm concerned about. If it's flooding me, can I call somebody and say, shut that pump off? I've been living there for years. I've watched that creek. I've seen it go over 7 twice, without adding this water. And, there was a question on his culvert. Well, in 2000, they changed the culvert and they made it a cement culvert. But the culvert that they had drew air. Somebody went through it, you wouldn't drown. Now they went lower and flatter and wider, so there's a differential. Now, right now in the drought, there's only like a 2-inch differential, 1.5, 2 inches, but I've seen it a foot differential. And now they want to back it up even more on that side. It doesn't make any sense to me. So, that's something that's going to have to be addressed, because if the whole meadow is, if you put the culvert up to get air,
you'd have to raise the whole bed all the way across that meadow, probably a foot. So, I don't know, but that's my complaint, or my, not really a complaint, but concern. Is if I'm flooding, will they shut that pump off? That's my comment.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Yes, sir, right in front, and then we'll go to you, sir.
Leroy Smith, P.O. Box 252, Pilger, Minnesota. I own the property right at the head of the Long Prairie River where it's going to be discharged. And although I really don't have a lot of questions on the project, mine is probably a little bit older. I've already have some deterioration and erosion at my on my property that has happened over 100 years, and evidently it's eroded away to where it's just changed. It's much deeper there than whatever it was anticipated. And I wonder who determines that, who maintains that. This particular watershed does my property absolutely no good. In fact, if you go back and talk to the old timers many, many years ago, it wasn't even supposed to go across that property. Rather than, it was done with a dredge, and rather to take the dredge apart and go across the railroad tracks and put it back together, they went closer to the river. But who determines the maintenance? Could anybody ask me that? Or do I just have to continually see my property be eroded away?
Is your question on ditch 41, or are you?
Yes, it is.
Ditch 41, this board is the drainage authority. So if work needs to be done on ditch 41, that's this board with Nancy being the administrator. So if there needs to be repairs to the original condition, this board has the authority to do that.
Okay. Yeah. What is the discharge rate in the creek now? How many gallons per minute go out the creek and into the river?
So the question is, how many, what's the flow in the
What's the flow in the creek currently?
So our estimate based off of our observations and measurements on June 17th and 18th was about 30 cubic feet per second. So if I'm doing my math right, if 10 cubic feet per second is 4,500 gallons, so twice that is 9,000, so 13,500 gallons a minute. Somewhere in there, roughly.
Yeah, well, when I just look at the creek and look at the width of it, and you say it's gonna come up 1.5 inches, and it's, 2 foot deep now, and look at the width, it just don't hardly compute. This is my only question, and I'm not opposed to this project. I'm concerned about the erosion to my property because it is my property. But I certainly give the lake my sympathy, and I'm not opposed to the water moving through there. I just want it done in an orderly fashion. And I thank you.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman in the back.
My name is Brian Rapway. I have 200 acres at 32026 Quicken Road. Plus, I have property in Scandia Township in Morrison County. Plus, I own property in Philbrook. I got this letter in the mail for a reason, and that's because my property is affected by ditch 41. That's why I'm here. I've been listening all night to everybody talking about monitoring things, doing things, the levels in the ditch and going through people's property and this and that. And I'm really wondering why, is the way I understand it, when the waters comes out of Chaminade, it's going to go to Highway 10. It's going to take a left. That's going to be in a pipe, right? Buried in the ground, from what Rick told me.
Maybe we'll stop right there. I don't know. So Mr. Opat, or if you know the area he's talking about.
Because you're just not going to run it in the ditch. It's going to be in a pipe. I take it to the dump area near the railroad, right?
Yeah, so east of Highway 10, the water comes in a buried pipe from the pump down the east side of
the DOT
Okay.
right away?
If you come out of Chaminade and you're sitting looking west on Highway 10, if you look north down Highway 10, the Long Prairie River crosses just south of Motley. With all this expense and all this monitoring and all these levels and all this thing, Todd County cannot not look at why you didn't pump the water to the Long Prairie River there. You're going to pump it, by my calculations, you're going to pump it in a pipe 2 miles south, go west for how many miles, go north for how many miles, and then put it in the Long Prairie River, where it's eventually going to go right under the bridge in Motley. So why don't you just pump the water out of Chaminade, go up Highway 10? It's 5 miles. So it's 3 miles more than what the existing pipe is going to be right now. There it goes. You don't have to worry about any landowners. You told me tonight you have permission from MnDOT to go in the ditch. So you have permission from the DNR to go into the river. And you can, and I've attended a lot of meetings. I've done a lot of things. I've sat at city council meetings trying to do various things I do. And I've seen a lot of people ask for variances and things like that. And one comment that stuck into my head was this guy one time was trying to get a variance to get something done. And he's explaining it. And the city council member stopped him right there and he said, "Say, sir," because the guy used the word, the most economical or the cheapest way to do it. He looked at that man and he said, "It's not in the council's interest to do it the cheapest way. It's in the council's interest to do it the way it should be done." And I don't know why you don't come out to Highway 10, go north. It's 5 miles. When you come, the bridge is mile marker 116. Chaminade Road, that Star Road or whatever is where it comes to Highway 10, is mile marker 121. It's 5 miles. You're paying to go 2 miles one way. All it takes is to go 3 miles the other way. You can pump year round if you put the pipe deep enough. You can do anything you want. It's right in the ditch. You don't have to worry about flooding hay fields. You don't have to worry about doing anything. You don't have to worry about monitoring levels. But what's that going to cost per year to monitor all these gauges and hire people to monitor this stuff? Sure, you have a Houston engineering firm come in. Who are they hired by? They're hired by Lake Chaminade. Is Todd County doing anything to make sure their information's right? I heard from Rick, he said, well, they're going to come up with the same information. How do you know that? They're working for the county. So is the attorneys. We got to get some input that Todd County, they got to actually use the term, grab the bull by the horns and look at this in their own interest. I can guarantee you the people that dug that ditch in 1916, they weren't intending to drain Lake Chaminade on it. I can guarantee you that. I don't know what you're thinking, what your thing is, and you can't tell me that you pump it and you don't have the power to pump it, because I lost 150 trees on one of my property putting in a power pole, a power line to supply the area for all the power they need for the next 100 years. So you look at all the costs that it's going to cost to monitor these levels, to put things in, to get this, to get that, and you look at the price that would go 3 miles up the highway, more than what you're going already. You take the $200,000 that Todd County is going to give you, or Morrison County is going to give you, apply that to it. It's not that much. There's no monitoring. There's not worrying about people complaining about their things flooding. It's done. It's in the ditch. It's a buried pipe. Pump as much as you want. Let these people have their properties and not have to worry about pumping water through their fields and their pipes and everything. I really think you should, and I don't think the Todd County Board can make a decision on this until they make the lid thoroughly examine this option. If you really think about it, that is the right thing to do. Why would you pump the water 2 miles one way, 5 miles the other way, 6 miles the other way, all to have it go under the bridge south of Motley there, where, you know what I mean, where you'd pump it anyways. I think it's ridiculous. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Maureen Anderson. I live at 4542 Canterbury Road near Chaminade. I had a big, long list of things I would like to say and to ask you, but I will keep it as short as I can. I was part of a group called Options for High Water. We formed in September of 2018. I'm kind of nervous, so excuse me.
Just take your time, ma'am. There's
Okay.
no worry.
Even though we're no longer active, our main conviction was and still remains that we never want to make Chaminade's problem water someone else's problem. We said that from the beginning. We were concerned about the LID's approach, excuse me, the LID's approach to how they were handling the water. So we got together and we formed this group. We spent $12,000 that was donated from neighbors of the lake, people on the lake. Then we had donated volunteer hours and equipment. We used an irrigation pump that pushed 700 gallons a minute of water to a swale, we called it. It was kind of a holding pond. And from there, nature took its course and pushed the water off into what this gentleman was talking about, the Long Prairie River, up north of 28. We set out to prove the concept by the end of July 2019. We successfully removed 50 million gallons of water from Chaminade. 1 inch, vertical inch of water on a lake the size of Chaminade would be about 40 million gallons. So we removed 1 inch plus of water. Several people that year made statements that if it hadn't been for our group doing that work, their house would have flooded in 2019. Excuse me. We asked the LID board to help us secure a permit to continue because we could only get a permit from the DNR to go that 50 million gallons. The first thing they said was no, they wouldn't help us. They wouldn't help us do anything. They wanted us to stop our work, even though we were getting results. They wanted us to just go away. And they wanted the Lake Chaminade LID members to have only one option to vote on, and that was their project. We were appalled. We were disturbed. We were hurt because we had put in our lives, our own money, our time. My husband and I manned that pump 24 hours a day. We were disturbed. I do have a copy of that, of our report that we did for a matter of record. It's the same report, sir, that we turned into the regulating authorities that worked with us. And the only thing that's changed on that is we no longer have the PO box. So I crossed that out and put my initials by it.
All right, for the record, we'll indicate that what's been submitted, it says on a picture, options for high water. Below that says Lake Chaminade, Motley, Minnesota, 2019 high water project report. We'll make that part of the record.
On October 6th of 2019, I got a letter from the LID. They asked us to restart our project because they determined then that the water was at emergency levels. They wanted us to provide all the labor, all the financial, all the equipment, everything to do this project. And then they would consider pulling another permit. We declined. It was already getting to the point where the ice was going to start, and we just didn't have what it took to pull all that together. There are other options. What I'm saying this to tell you is there are other options, just like this man talked about before me. There's been a group that has cleaned out the ditch along County Road 203. That's helped considerably. There's also been another independent, highly detailed high water mitigation project. And that proposal was given to the LID and the proper authorities. It was a top-notch project. The LID also disregarded that. There was no response that I'm aware of. There's also been suggestions to the LID, things like moving the water to its historic flow. And I think your soil and water is Lou Nasca. He was at a board meeting for the Fawn Lake Township that I was at. He even recommended that that would be an option to look at. The LID won't do that. They just pass everything off. It was suggested that they hire a dewatering company. There's dewatering companies that could come in from like the Iron Range. They could suck Lake Chaminade dry in a couple weeks for a fraction of the cost. They won't even listen when we try to talk about this. Even we talked with them about scaling back the project. So they didn't pull, when you're talking 10 cubic feet per second, I had to really wrap my brain around that. So I Googled. I don't know any other way to do it. What I realized was if you took an average 4-inch hose that a fire department uses on an average hydrant, that sprays out at around 500 cubic feet per second. I think I'm saying that right. If you just Google feet per second, what I'm saying with all that is a fire hydrant hose, you would have, what is that? 9 times the pressure of a fire hydrant hose. That just is how I had to think about it. One other thing I thought about, we worked closely with the soil and water in Morrison County. And I kept hearing about this comprehensive local water plan. And so I asked for a copy, and here it is, but I only have this one copy. So if anybody is interested, they could get this water plan. You've probably already seen it. It goes from 2017 to 2022. I think that's what they're working on, a new plan to move forward.
Do you want to make that part of the record, or we can get that from, you want to make a record that you'd like that part of the record, and then we will get
Yes,
a copy?
I would, yes,
Nancy will
ma'am.
be able to get
Yes,
a
sir.
copy. Nancy, you
Yes.
see what it is? It says one plan, 5 watershed, 2017 to 2022. We'll get a copy of that and make that part of the record.
Okay. What I really got out of that, I read the whole thing, makes a very interesting afternoon read. What I got out of that, on page 20, it states that one of the purposes of the plan is the protection of groundwater quantity. It goes on to explain how important it is to maintain our water supply. Our top concern is, and this I'm quoting, the noticeable increase in irrigation systems within the county, and will the aquifers recharge quickly enough to handle the demand? Then it says, then regarding an increase in the appropriation permits, I'm quoting again, this is a quality and quantity issue. It discusses further how we need to maintain and not just the shoreland adjacent to in the lakes, but the impact zone which would be the wetlands. I would like to say maybe our plea to Todd County is please don't take our water from us. Morrison County and the businesses need their water. We keep hearing about a wet hydrologic cycle. We have a drought. We've been in a drought for years. If you look on the internet, even it comes up and tells you what a drought we're in. We believe that Todd County and Ditch 41 are not Chamina's only option. More importantly, Todd County does not have to become responsible to bear the burden of the solution for Chamina's water problem. You as a discharge authority and your constituents should not feel the need, should not need to feel pressured to help or rescue Chamina from its problem water. We respectfully request that the Todd County officials answer or find some answers to, I've got a couple questions I would like to go over. We realize that in a March 9th, 2021 letter to Todd County, the lid states that due to their monitoring of their approved budget, they would provide other required documentation or engineering information. We ask that you please be more discerning than that. Find your own answers, please. Could I?
Madam Chair, it's a little past, and you're going to make all your comments, and we want to make sure we leave time for it, but it's obvious we're not going to finish tonight, in my opinion. We have people online that have questions. Chris, I understand. There's still probably a number of people here that may have comments. So I think we need to discuss whether we keep going tonight, which I think has really no end in sight, probably with still some unanswered questions. So our thought is we could continue this hearing to a specific time and date, but let me back up on that. There was 102 notices or something, so noticing another hearing is not insurmountable. This is my recommendation. The board can do whatever they want. A couple of things that the engineer correctly commented was that they need input on the operating plan from Todd County. And also, it's been raised the questions just to have a check on the engineer's analysis, which I have no reason to doubt, but it's always good to have a check on someone's work. So the statute under 103E 241 allows for a consulting engineer. So what I guess what I'm getting to, I don't want to just continue it to date without having some things that are going to happen in between now and then if the board thinks they need information. And I know the board has indicated that they may want someone to check on what should be in the operating plan. I'm not qualified to say this is where the gauge should be, and I don't know that any of the board members would feel qualified to do. Anyway, I'm really going on here. My thought is we're not going to finish tonight. I don't want to continue it to a very specific time and place, because if you do decide tonight through your action to want a consulting engineer, we need to give them enough time to do that. So I think I'll stop there and get some input from the board, because it makes it sound like I'm saying what to do. I need to know what the board, before you make a decision, you have to feel comfortable. You have all the information. You may feel that, well, we haven't completed the testimony, or you may have some information you'd like to see. I guess Madam Chair, if you or members of the board want to kind of direct me where you'd like this to go, or we aren't going to finish tonight. It's obvious is what I'm saying.
Any suggestions?
Madam Chair, I would move that we ask for a consulting firm to give us information on looking at the information that's provided to us on the operating plan, and that we probably would then schedule another meeting after them consultants have given us that information.
And provided it to the petitioners and anybody else that wants to see it.
Yes. And that we allow this lady to continue and then we adjourn the meeting for tonight to recess it. So,
Okay, that was a motion
Yes.
from Kircher. Is there a second?
I would second it with the, including the fact that I would like to hear from the rest of the public yet too, before we'd ever make any kind of
Right,
decision.
at a later, yeah, we're not, I want to
So
stress, by
so-
ending it tonight, we're in no way, if we have to go another 10 out, whatever it takes, we're going to do.
I agree.
And then secondly, with the board's approval, if I could make a couple recommendations on consulting engineers, whether it's now or later, we want to make sure we get a water engineer, and there's a couple I can recommend, and I can do that. And they're well respected, and I think Houston Engineer would agree they're well respected.
Okay.
So
Comments or questions?
maybe I'll put it on the record. The people I'm thinking of is Bill Helget from Bolton and Mink, or Chuck Brandel from ISG. Both of them are well respected water engineers in the state, and their firms are also.
Okay. Kurt, at the beginning of this, the lid was going to take all cost. Is this a cost of the lid then? Or is it a cost of Todd County?
Well, my position is it's the cost of the lid. It's part of the process.
That we have to
John
go
may,
through.
Mr. Shockey may have a different opinion, but I think from the beginning, it's been the position that the residents, the landowners on ditch 41 will not bear costs. So, but I'll let them have input on that. So.
Okay.
And again, one thing I want to stress, we do not give a blank piece of, if you get a consulting engineer, working with your county engineer, will give very defined parameters, and we'll let the petitioners know these are the questions we want answered. It's not just spend as much as you want and go wherever you want on this.
Okay. For the record,
Maybe the petitioners want to make any comment on that. So.
Thank you. I guess one of my concerns is a timing perspective. If the choice is made to retain an outside engineer, there are certain rights the petitioner has under law regarding the decision-making process. And I wouldn't want to see that process dragged out over time, so whoever, if there was a engineer that was retained, I guess our request would be that they would be retained very quickly and get their work done as quickly as possible.
And that's a reasonable request. I would make the contact if the board directs me immediately and get a timeline that I would relay to anybody that wanted to know. But I agree with, and so does everybody in the audience, this is not something to drag out. When the board gets the information, they feel they're ready to make a decision, the board has indicated to me they will make the decision, but they want to feel comfortable that they have all the information that they need to make. Well, I heard they're not under any timeline because we weren't in the public hearing process. They could spend as much time as they wanted prior to the petition. So that's irrelevant to this. So.
okay, I have a motion by Commissioner Kircher, a second by Commissioner Erickson. Is there any other comments or questions from the board?
Madam Chair, I would just add and agree with the attorney that we expedite the process as quickly as we can. And as soon as this board has that information, then we would have another meeting. Scheduled.
Reconvene the public hearing.
We'll try and get that as quickly as we can.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And it carries. Thank you. And we'll let you continue on, please.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Shockey.
Oh,
I guess a couple things. We're still not, I don't, just so that it's clear, we're not necessarily agreeing that it's the lid's cost. I mean, we'll have to go back and make a determination of whether or not.
I'll get an estimate from the engineer to do what I think they need to do to answer the questions that I know the board has. I'll relay that to the petitioners and they can let us know their position. We won't retain anybody until we know an estimated cost and the position of the petitioners. And I think that's legitimate. Nobody would just But yeah, I think that's a legitimate request. I want to know what it's going to cost. The board should know what it's going to cost, so.
And just for the record, the petitioner is available. We're ready and willing to continue the public hearing tonight. I know the board's gonna ultimately make its decision, but just for the record, we are willing to continue the public hearing as long as it takes tonight. And so we don't want to be on record as holding up the process at all. So we're prepared to, if the board wanted to go all night, we're here. to
And
answer
that's
questions.
fine for the record that they're not holding it up.
No.
I understand that.
But, you know, the first 2 hours.
Right.
It was
It
there.
diminishes its impact the
It-
longer you go.
Yeah.
But let's finish, just so she's up here, finish if it's only going to take another 5 minutes or so. And then we'll continue
And
the
I
hearing.
believe in Dave's or Commissioner Kurtz's, you said that we would adjourn after this week, or is that correct?
Yes.
We'll continue, we won't adjourn, we'll continue it
just-
to a later
We'll-
date.
Well, recess or whatever.
Recess or continue.
Yes.
Yeah, I used the wrong term.
Do you have a
sorry.
few more comments?
Well,
on that?
Madam Chair, I do have like 10 questions, and some of them are very multifaceted. So
Why don't
could
then,
I- Yeah. I
in
could
fairness
pick
to
up-
her and everybody here, at the continued hearing, we'll give you an ample opportunity to ask
I
those
appreciate
questions.
that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
See,
Question from the
Sure.
chair was,
should they be put in record tonight so that we could see her questions, or should they be held until we?
It's up to her whenever. I'd rather have her ask the questions than
Okay.
submit them ahead of time. When she gets
Okay.
back up there, when she's done with her questions, if she has them in writing, she can put them part of the record.
Okay,
So.
very good.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank
ma'am.
you.
So then, if everybody's following this discussion, tonight's meeting will be continued or recessed. You'll get a notice of another hearing. In the meantime, I'll be contacting as soon as possible, immediately, consulting engineer with very specific items to review, so that the next meeting, several people raised, they'd like somebody else to just check it, and that's what we're gonna do. All right, I think that'll take care of tonight, Madam Chair.
Very good. Thank you for
So look in
attending.
your mail for another notice.
So,